Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The rain had already begun by the time Aaron's car reached the old dirt road. It wasn't a heavy storm, not yet, but the steady drizzle blurred his windshield and softened the shapes of the trees pressing in on either side. He slowed, the tires crunching against gravel, as he followed the twisting path deeper into the forest. He had been told the lodge would be there, hidden beyond the pines. A forgotten place where hunters once stayed, where travelers once gathered before the forest was abandoned. His uncle had spoken of it like a relic, a family property that hadn't seen light or warmth in decades. Aaron expected silence when he arrived, but instead, the forest greeted him with sound. Branches swaying under the weight of rain, the hiss of water dripping onto moss, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of thunder rolling across the hills. The lodge appeared slowly through the fog, its roof slanted and its porch sagging. Yet the sight of it made Aaron's breath catch. It was bigger than he imagined, 3 stories of dark wood and narrow windows, like a shadow frozen in time. When he stepped from the car, the forest pressed closer. The smell of wet earth filled his lungs. He noticed an old stone fire pit just off the porch, blackened with ash as though someone had used it recently. But that wasn't possible. No one was supposed to be here. Aaron shivered, pulling his coat tighter. He looked up at the broken windows, the tall pines towering above, and felt the weight of the forest watching. The rain grew heavier. He grabbed his bag, pushed open the creaking door, and stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood and ash, as if the last fire inside the lodge had been put out just hours before. And then he heard it. A faint crackle. The unmistakable sound of firewood burning. But there was no fire in sight. The door groaned as Aaron closed it behind him, and the weight of the lodge settled around him like a damp cloak. He stood still in the foyer, listening to the muted rain tapping against the roof, the soft hiss of wind slipping through cracks in the wood, and that faint, troubling sound of firewood burning. He couldn't see where it came from. The hearth in the main room stood cold and empty, just a gray bed of ash. The sound, however, continued faintly, like an echo of flames that no longer existed. He stepped forward cautiously, each floorboard bending under his weight, moaning as though the house itself disliked being disturbed. The interior was larger than he expected. The ceilings were high and vaulted, beams stretching across like the ribs of some skeletal creature. Old furniture was scattered throughout the space, chairs that seemed too heavy to move, a long dining table scarred with deep cuts, as though knives had been driven into it in anger. Dust lay thick on everything, but here and there were signs of disturbance. Smudges on the table, footprints half faded in the dust, a lantern resting on the mantel as though it had been used not long ago. Aaron's chest tightened at the thought. This lodge was supposed to have been abandoned for decades, yet the signs suggested otherwise. The sound of crackling grew louder when he moved toward the western hall. A corridor stretched into shadows, the far end swallowed in darkness. He pulled out his flashlight, the weak beam slicing through floating dust motes. The wooden walls seemed to bend inward, the corridor narrower than it should have been, the air cooler, heavier. His light passed over framed photographs that hung crooked along the wall, faded images of men with rifles, groups standing proudly beside deer carcasses, a few families bundled in coats. Their eyes, dulled with time, seemed to follow him as he walked. Halfway down the hall, he stopped. The sound of firewood had become so distinct that he was sure a fire must be burning nearby. But the smell didn't match. There was no comforting aroma of smoke or pine resin, only damp wood and something sour, almost metallic, clinging to the back of his throat. He pushed onward, his hand brushing the wall to steady himself as the boards creaked like voices whispering beneath his boots. The hall ended at a heavy wooden door. Its surface was blackened as though scorched long ago, and yet it stood intact. Aaron hesitated before reaching for the iron handle, cold and slick in his hand. When he pushed the door open, the sound stopped. The silence struck him harder than any noise. No crackling, no burning, not even the rain outside could be heard for a moment. The stillness was complete. Inside, the room was empty save for a circle of stones in the center of the floor, arranged like a fire pit, though it made no sense to have one indoors. Black soot stained the ceiling above it, and the boards around the stones were dark, warped, almost melted. Aaron crouched to examine it, his light glinting off something buried in the ash. He brushed it aside with his fingers and revealed a fragment of bone, thin and pale, brittle as if it had been burned. His heart raced. It didn't look like an animal bone. Before he could study it further, a noise came from the hall behind him. Not the crackling of phantom fire this time, but something slower, heavier, the sound of footsteps on the old wooden floor. Aaron froze, listening, his breath held tight in his chest. The footsteps were faint but deliberate, coming closer, stopping, then starting again. He swung the flashlight toward the doorway, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom. Nothing was there. Only the empty hall, the crooked photographs, and the shifting shadows cast by his light. The air pressed against him, thick with tension, as if the entire lodge was waiting for him to move. The silence, broken only by his pounding heart, seemed alive, listening. Aaron swallowed hard, stood, and slowly backed away from the fire pit. He felt the bone fragments slip from his hand, falling into the ash with a soft crack. The footsteps returned, louder now, pacing just outside the room, moving past the door, stopping once more as though someone, or something, was deciding whether to enter. Aaron's hand shook as he tightened his grip on the flashlight, his mind racing. He told himself it could be the house settling, boards swelling with the damp air, or his imagination feeding him illusions. But deep down he knew. The footsteps had rhythm, weight, intent. Someone else was in the lodge. Aaron forced himself to remain still, gripping the flashlight like it could defend him. His ears strained in the quiet, searching for any clue of movement. The footsteps had stopped, but silence didn't feel safe here. It felt like something was waiting. He slowly edged toward the door of the scorched room, his eyes flicking back to the circle of stones on the floor. The bone fragment was gone. He froze, staring at the ash. He had dropped it only seconds ago, but now the pale sliver had vanished as if it had never existed. The ash looked undisturbed, perfectly level, as though his hands had never touched it. A cold shiver slid down his spine. When he leaned into the hall, his light beam quivered against the walls. The photographs seemed closer than before, tilted at sharper angles, and the figures in them looked different. Their faces, once faded and dull, now seemed clearer, sharpened by shadows, eyes glinting faintly as though wet. His stomach turned as he realized every person in the photos was staring directly at him. He snapped his head away, forcing himself not to look too long, and aimed the light down the corridor. That was when he saw it. A shape at the far end of the hall, half hidden in the gloom. At first it looked like nothing more than a trick of shadows, a patch where the darkness had gathered too thickly, but the longer he looked, the more solid it became. A tall, human-like figure, standing motionless, its head bent slightly as if listening. Aaron's throat tightened. He raised the flashlight higher, but the beam seemed to falter, its brightness thinning against the shape like it resisted being revealed. Still, he caught a faint outline, long arms hanging unnaturally low, shoulders hunched, and a face that looked pale and hollow, like it had been carved out of wax and left near a flame too long. Aaron stumbled back into the scorched room, his heart hammering. He wanted to run, but every direction felt dangerous. If he went deeper into the lodge, he might trap himself. If he ran outside into the storm, he'd be lost in the woods with miles of dark forest pressing in on him. He tried to breathe steadily, whispering to himself that it wasn't real, that it had to be some illusion conjured by exhaustion and the oppressive air of the place. But then he heard the sound again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer. The boards creaked as the figure advanced, one heavy step after another, echoing down the hall. The sound matched the rhythm of a body walking. Aaron's pulse surged in his ears, and sweat broke across his forehead. He fumbled for something he could use as a weapon, his flashlight beam jerking wildly across the scorched room. His eyes fell on a broken chair propped against the wall. He grabbed one of its legs, splintered at the end, gripping it tightly in his free hand. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Silence swelled again, deep and suffocating. Aaron could almost feel the presence there, something tall and heavy standing on the other side of the threshold, waiting for him. The air smelled stronger now, damp with old smoke and that same metallic tang he couldn't name. He held his breath, muscles tense, every nerve screaming for him to run. Then, slowly, the door began to close. Not with a slam, but with a steady, deliberate push, the wood groaning as it moved. Aaron backed farther into the room, his flashlight trembling in his grip. When the door shut completely, the latch clicking into place on its own, he felt a wave of cold wash over him, as though the thing had sealed him in. He pointed the light at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained still, as though nothing had touched it. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. Finally, Aaron gathered his courage and reached for the handle. His palm was slick with sweat, his heart in his throat. He pressed down on the iron grip and pulled. The door opened easily, swinging wide without resistance. The hall was empty. The figure was gone. The photographs on the wall had faded back into dullness, the eyes once again cloudy and lifeless. But Aaron knew he hadn't imagined it. He had heard the steps, seen the shape, felt the air grow colder when it stood outside. Something else was inside the lodge with him, moving silently when it wanted, showing itself when it pleased. He wiped his damp hand on his jeans, his breathing uneven, and turned back toward the foyer. The rain outside had grown louder, battering the roof, and thunder cracked closer now, shaking the glass panes of the narrow windows. He needed to make a fire, he thought. He needed light, warmth, something to fight the weight of the shadows pressing in around him. The fire pit outside, the one blackened with ash, flickered in his memory. He grabbed the lantern from the mantel, checked that it still held fuel, and struck it with the old flint lighter left beside it. A flame sputtered, caught, and grew, casting golden light across the room. The shadows retreated, but only slightly. With the lantern in one hand and the chair leg in the other, Aaron moved back toward the porch. The rain had nearly drowned the forest now, a silver curtain falling from the sky. He crouched by the old fire pit, his coat clinging to him, and placed the lantern on the ground. The pit was wet but not soaked through. He searched for dry wood under the porch roof and found a few splintered planks he could use. His fingers worked clumsily, arranging them into a pyramid, striking the flint again until sparks caught. A small flame rose, hungry and fragile, licking at the wood. He shielded it from the rain until it grew, flames curling upward. For the first time since entering the forest, Aaron felt a flicker of relief. The fire's glow painted the trees in warm light, the crackle real and steady this time. But as he sat back, letting the warmth reach his face, he noticed something that turned his stomach cold once more. Across the fire pit, just beyond the glow, stood the shape again. Tall, unmoving, its features swallowed by shadow. It hadn't made a sound this time. It had simply appeared, watching from the tree line, waiting. Aaron's skin prickled as soon as he saw it. The shape stood just beyond the reach of the fire's glow, where the shadows thickened between the pines. It didn't move, didn't sway with the wind, didn't even seem touched by the rain that poured around it. At first, Aaron told himself it was just a tree trunk, crooked and oddly placed, but the longer he stared, the less convincing that thought became. It had form, and more than form, it had intention. The dark weight of its presence seemed to rest directly on him, as though every drop of rain and every beat of his heart was being measured by that faceless watcher. He leaned forward, gripping the broken chair leg tighter. The fire crackled between them, casting bursts of orange and gold against the figure, but the light never quite reached it. It remained swallowed in shadow, its pale suggestion of a face hovering just above the glow. Aaron tried to blink it away, to shake himself into believing it was nothing more than exhaustion, the long drive, the storm, the suffocating silence of the lodge. Yet every instinct screamed otherwise. Something was there, watching him breathe, watching him shiver, watching him burn the fire brighter in a desperate attempt to hold it back. The rain came harder, fat droplets hissing when they struck the fire. Steam rose in pale ribbons, drifting upward like ghostly fingers. Aaron shifted closer to the pit, shielding the flame with his body. He couldn't look away from the thing beyond the trees. At one point, he thought he saw it tilt its head, slow and deliberate, like a curious animal studying its prey. His stomach twisted. He told himself that if it stepped closer, if it crossed into the circle of firelight, he would run inside the lodge and bolt the door, but a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that the walls would not stop it. A crack of thunder split the sky, and for an instant the forest was lit white. In that flash, the figure's outline burned into his vision. Long arms dangling past its knees, shoulders narrow but sharp, and a face that had no features except the deep hollows where eyes should be. When the thunder faded and the darkness returned, Aaron almost wished the light hadn't come at all. It was easier to believe in shadows than to see the shape clearly, even for a second. The fire sputtered, fighting the rain. He scrambled for more wood, his fingers slick and trembling as he shoved damp pieces into the flames. Sparks hissed, the heat fighting desperately against the downpour. He whispered to himself to stay calm, to keep the fire alive. Fire was life. Fire was safety. His uncle had always said that nothing lingers near flame for long in these woods, nothing that doesn't belong. But as Aaron fed the pit, he noticed something that made his heart sink. The figure hadn't retreated. If anything, it was closer. Not by much, but enough. It now stood just a step nearer the circle of light, still silent, still dripping shadow. Aaron blinked hard, rubbed at his eyes, then looked again. It hadn't moved in front of him. It was as if it had simply chosen to be closer when he wasn't looking. The kind of shift that prey never sees until it's too late. Aaron's pulse hammered in his ears, his breath shallow in his throat. He thought about fleeing into the forest, but the rain had swallowed everything beyond the trees, and he would only end up lost, stumbling through mud and fog until he collapsed. The lodge was behind him, looming like a black mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Neither option felt safe. He was pinned between two hungers, one old and wooden, the other tall and faceless. Then, without warning, the fire surged. Flames leapt high, brighter than before, as though something had breathed life into them. Aaron flinched, raising a hand to shield his eyes, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. The tree line stood empty, just dripping bark and sheets of silver rain. Relief flooded him, shaky and thin, but it was enough to let him exhale for the first time in what felt like hours. He sat back on the wet ground, staring into the flames, letting their warmth burn against his cold skin. But even as the fire roared higher, a thought wormed its way into his head, one he couldn't shake. The fire hadn't grown because of him. He hadn't added wood, hadn't fanned the flames, hadn't done anything to spark such sudden life. The fire had grown on its own, as though answering something unseen. And now, as he listened carefully through the steady hiss of rain, he realized the crackle of the flames wasn't right. It didn't sound like wood alone. It had an edge to it, like the faint echo of laughter, low and distorted, hiding in the burning. Aaron's hands clenched the chair leg tighter. His eyes scanned the trees, the porch, the black windows of the lodge looming behind him. Nothing moved. Yet he knew the watcher hadn't gone. It had only stepped aside, waiting for him to think he was safe. Aaron sat by the fire until the cold began to bite deeper than the flames could push back. The rain showed no sign of easing. It drummed endlessly on the roof, on the porch, on the trees. Every so often the fire crackled in a way that didn't sound right, sharp edges of sound that made him lean closer, unsure if it was the wood breaking or something else hidden in the hiss. He tried to focus on the warmth, telling himself that fire meant safety, but the thought wouldn't settle. The faceless thing at the tree line lingered in his mind, and though it no longer stood there when he looked, the sense of being watched never left. The forest had eyes even if he couldn't see them. At last, with his clothes heavy from rain and his nerves stretched thin, Aaron forced himself back toward the lodge. He snatched the lantern from the ground, its glow pale against the storm, and hurried up the sagging steps. The door groaned as he pushed inside. At once, the sound of the rain softened, muffled by the thick wooden walls, and the oppressive silence returned. The lodge swallowed sound like it was hungry for it. He shut the door firmly, slid the rusted bolt into place, and turned, his light falling across the wide main hall. For a moment he thought he could breathe easier. The air inside was warmer, though damp, and the firelight flickered faintly through the windows. But then he heard it, a murmur, faint and broken, drifting down from the upper floor. He froze, every muscle tensed. It sounded like voices, whispers too soft to catch, layered over one another, rising and falling as though in conversation. Aaron tilted his head, straining to listen. The longer he stood, the clearer it became. Not words he could recognize, but a cadence, a rhythm, as though a group spoke in a language he had never heard. He tightened his grip on the lantern and moved toward the staircase. Each step groaned beneath him, sharp in the quiet. Halfway up, the whispers faltered, pausing, as though whoever spoke had noticed him. He stopped too, standing still on the stairs, staring into the shadows above. After a long moment, the voices began again, slower now, deliberate, like they wanted him to know they were aware. Aaron's chest tightened as he reached the landing. The upper hall stretched out on both sides, lined with doors that leaned slightly off their hinges. The whispers seemed to seep from every crack, every seam of those doors. He moved cautiously, his lantern throwing long shadows across the warped floorboards. One door on the right caught his attention. It was slightly open, the darkness behind it thicker, almost pulsing with sound. The whispers grew louder as he neared, sharp bursts now cutting through the air, a language broken into shards. He pushed the door open slowly, light spilling into the room. Dust floated like pale snow in the glow. Inside there was no furniture, no rugs, no bed, only bare walls and a floor scarred with deep scratches, gouged into the wood like something had clawed its way across again and again. Aaron lifted the lantern higher, and that was when he saw them. Shapes scrawled onto the walls in ash. Circles, crooked symbols, and jagged marks that looked half like writing, half like drawings of something that should not exist. The whispers throbbed around him, echoing off the walls. He stumbled back, his pulse thundering, and the lantern flickered as though the air itself tried to smother it. The whispers sharpened suddenly, rising in tone, not like speech now but like cries, hundreds of them, layered and broken. Aaron's knees buckled, his free hand clutching his head as the noise drilled into him. The symbols on the wall seemed to shimmer in the lantern light, curling, twisting, moving as though alive. He staggered back into the hall, slamming the door shut behind him. At once, the voices cut off. Silence fell so quickly it made his ears ring. Aaron leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. The lantern flickered weakly, its flame nearly dying before catching again. The scratches on the floor outside the room stretched into the hall now that he looked closer, gouges that trailed along the boards, weaving left and right as though something had crawled on its belly, dragging claws through the wood. They led away from the door, deeper into the hall. His breath fogged the lantern glass as he followed them, drawn against his better judgment. The scratches ended at another door, this one closed tight. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, something inside scraped sharply against the floor. Not random, not faint, an intentional drag like a chair leg being pulled across the boards. He staggered back, holding the lantern high, his heart in his throat. Then the whispers started again, louder this time, spilling from under the door in a rush, words tumbling over each other, a rising chant. Aaron stumbled away, nearly dropping the lantern, and turned back toward the staircase. The air grew thick with sound, pressing against his skull until he thought his head would split. He fled down the stairs, his boots slamming against the steps, the lantern's flame whipping in the draft. When he reached the bottom and stumbled into the main hall, the lodge groaned around him, beams creaking as though the house itself had joined in the chorus. He spun, searching for escape, for any break in the storm outside, but the windows showed nothing but sheets of rain. He pressed his back against the cold stone of the hearth, clutching the lantern close. The whispers grew muffled again, retreating to the floor above, until at last only the rain filled his ears. Aaron slid down to the floor, breathing hard, trying to steady himself. The fire pit outside seemed impossibly far away now. The warmth, the light, it felt fragile compared to the crushing weight of this place. He thought again of the figure at the tree line, of its patience, its silence. Maybe it had never left at all. Maybe it had simply moved inside, filling the lodge with its voice, with the echoes that bled through every wall. For the first time since he'd arrived, Aaron wondered if stepping into this forest had already sealed his fate. Aaron sat on the cold floor with his back pressed against the hearth until the lantern stopped flickering and burned steady again. His heart still raced, his palms slick against the wooden chair leg clutched in one hand. He could almost believe the whispers had been a trick of his mind if it weren't for the scratches etched deep into the floor upstairs and the symbols seared into the wall as though something had branded the lodge long ago. The memory of that room, of the voices swelling to a chorus, still hummed in his ears, like they had left behind a residue that refused to fade. The rain outside had grown harsher, a constant roar that pressed through the walls like the forest itself was trying to get in. Thunder boomed above, rattling the windows, making the glass quiver. Aaron lifted the lantern and scanned the hall. Shadows shifted in the high beams overhead, heavy and deliberate, though nothing moved. He thought of leaving, just running into the storm, following the road until his legs gave out, but he knew how easily the forest could swallow a man whole. Without a light, without direction, he'd be gone in minutes. The lodge, no matter how alive it seemed, at least gave him walls to cling to. Gathering what courage he had left, Aaron rose to his feet and edged toward the northern corridor. He hadn't explored it yet, and some instinct told him if he stayed still, the voices would return. Movement, however dangerous, felt like survival. The corridor stretched long and crooked, lantern light painting warped shadows that clung to the walls like stains. The floor dipped in places where the boards had rotted. Rain leaked through the ceiling, dripping steadily into small puddles that reflected the trembling flame of his lantern. The air smelled stronger here, wet wood, mildew, and beneath it all, that same sour metallic tang. He passed a series of closed doors, their brass handles tarnished and green with corrosion. Each one bore scratches near the bottom, as though fingernails or claws had scraped them from the inside. He didn't dare open them. His boots squelched against the warped floorboards, each step loud in the silence. For a long while nothing stirred. Just the endless hiss of rain above, the groans of an old house under pressure. He began to wonder if he'd imagined the figure outside, if his nerves had shaped shadows into monsters, when he reached the end of the corridor and found something that made his stomach twist. The last door was wide open, revealing a narrow chamber lined with windows. All of them were shattered, glass long gone, leaving only jagged frames where the rain blew through in streaks. The floor was slick with water, small rivulets running across the boards to vanish between the cracks. In the middle of the room, a rocking chair swayed slowly back and forth, though there was no breeze strong enough to move it. Aaron stopped in the doorway, lantern raised, watching the chair creak on its runners. It was the only sound besides the storm, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. The motion was too steady, too deliberate. Someone had set it in motion. His hand tightened on the chair leg. He whispered to himself not to step inside, not to cross that threshold, but his feet disobeyed. One careful step, then another, the lanterns glowed chasing the shadows across the wet floor. The rocking chair kept moving as if mocking his hesitation. When he finally reached it, the chair slowed, then stopped entirely, perfectly still. He stood over it, the lantern light glinting off the slick wood, and realized the seat was damp, darker than the rest of the chair. Not from the rain. The stain was older, set deep into the fibers, a reddish-black color that his mind didn't want to name. Then the sound came again, not from the chair, not from the storm, but from the hall behind him. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the same measured rhythm he had heard before. His breath caught, every muscle in his body freezing. He turned his head inch by inch, the lantern trembling in his hand, and cast its glow back toward the corridor. The hallway was empty. Shadows stretched long and heavy, nothing else. But the footsteps continued, drawing nearer, closer, until they seemed to echo all around him. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, panic crawling up his throat. He wanted to run, but his legs felt heavy, bound by the thick silence pressing against him. Suddenly, the rocking chair behind him creaked, moving on its own. Aaron spun, his lantern swinging wildly. The chair rocked harder now, back and forth with force, as though someone unseen had gripped it and pushed. The sound of footsteps merged with the creaking, an awful rhythm filling the room until the storm outside seemed distant. And then, as quickly as it started, it all stopped. Silence dropped like a weight, crushing, absolute. Aaron stood trembling, the lantern casting a nervous glow across the wet floor. He thought he was alone again, until the reflection caught his eye. In the puddle at his feet, lit by the lantern, a shape loomed behind him. Tall, faceless, its arms hanging long. Aaron's blood turned cold. He didn't turn. He couldn't. He only stood there, staring into the trembling water, the figure towering over him in silence, unmoving, patient. Thunder rolled through the forest, shaking the windows, and when Aaron finally dared to look up, the reflection was gone. The room was empty once more. But he knew better. The thing was following him. The night had deepened, and though Aaron tried to distract himself by unpacking his things and exploring the lodge, the silence pressed down on him more heavily than the rain outside. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and every gust of wind rattled the glass in the upstairs windows, making him glance toward the stairs more often than he'd like. He decided he couldn't stay inside any longer, not with the way the shadows stretched and shifted across the cabin walls as if they were alive. Something in him urged him outside, toward the only thing that had ever felt stable in this place, the stone fire pit. By the time he stepped out onto the porch, the rain had softened into a mist, light enough that he could still hear the forest breathing beneath it. He walked toward the fire pit, dragging a bundle of wood he'd found earlier in the back shed. The logs were damp, but dry enough near the core to catch a flame. With effort, he managed to coax the fire to life. Sparks flew into the mist, disappearing as quickly as they were born, and then the fire settled into a steady crackle. The warmth spread against his skin, cutting through the damp chill. For the first time since arriving, Aaron thought maybe the night would be bearable. But he wasn't alone. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the mist. The rain had left the air thick, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the clearing. But as the flames grew brighter, he saw movement at the tree line. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. The shape was still, too still, like someone holding their breath. Aaron's heart pounded, but he forced himself to speak. "Hello." His voice cracked in the damp air. The figure didn't move. The fire popped, and Aaron flinched at the sound, his eyes locked on the stranger. "This is private property," he added, though his words carried more fear than authority. Finally, the figure stepped forward. A man, tall, draped in a rain-soaked coat. His face remained half hidden beneath a hood, but the way he moved was slow, deliberate, as though he'd been watching Aaron for a long while and had finally decided to be seen. Aaron's stomach tightened. The man stopped a few feet from the fire and lowered his hood. His skin was pale, almost too pale against the flames, and his eyes caught the light in a way that made Aaron's chest tighten. There was something unsettling about them, not unkind but distant, as though they belonged to someone who hadn't seen daylight in years. "You shouldn't be here," the man said softly, his voice carrying easily over the fire's crackle. Aaron frowned, struggling to find words. This lodge belongs to my family. My uncle left it to me." The man tilted his head, studying Aaron as if measuring his truth. Then he gave the faintest smile, though it never touched his eyes. "Your family may have left it, but the forest never did." The words sank into Aaron like cold water. He wanted to ask what the man meant, but before he could, the stranger sat down on the wet earth, cross-legged, staring into the flames as though Aaron wasn't even there. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing deep lines, more than a man his age should carry, and a hollow look in his eyes that made Aaron's skin crawl. Aaron cleared his throat, trying to sound steady. "Do you live out here?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a damp stick from the ground and prodded the fire. The flames hissed in response, sparks shooting into the mist. Finally he spoke, voice low. "I stay where the fire stays. It's the only thing that keeps the dark from swallowing us whole." The words twisted in Aaron's mind, heavy and cryptic. He wanted to ask who "us" referred to, but something in the man's tone told him he didn't want to know the answer. The forest seemed to lean closer, every drop of rain from the trees falling louder, more deliberate. Aaron's hand twitched toward the small hatchet he'd left leaning by the porch, but it was too far away now. The man suddenly turned his gaze on him, and Aaron froze. "Don't let it follow you inside," the stranger whispered. Aaron's throat went dry. What are you talking about?" The man leaned closer to the fire, the shadows cutting across his face. "The lodge remembers. It remembers everyone who ever walked through its doors. Some it let leave. Others, it kept." The fire flared suddenly, as if feeding on his words, and Aaron's pulse raced in his ears. He wanted to get up, to run back into the lodge and lock the doors, but his legs wouldn't move. The man stood without warning, water dripping from his coat, his eyes fixed once more on the tree line. "It's closer now," he muttered. Then, almost to himself, "The forest doesn't like new blood." Aaron stumbled to his feet, heart hammering. "Wait, what's closer? What's out there?" But the man was already moving, his figure melting back into the mist and trees. The rain thickened, swallowing him whole, until Aaron was left alone again with only the fire for company. He turned back toward the lodge, but the words wouldn't leave him. "Don't let it follow you inside." The lodge loomed darker than before, its broken windows reflecting the firelight like watching eyes. And for the first time, Aaron wished he had never come. The night pressed down with a weight that felt almost physical, a heavy velvet curtain of storm clouds and whispering rain that smothered the forest in layers of shadow. The crackle of the fire in the lodge's hearth became the only heartbeat in the silence, its rhythm oddly strained, as if the flames themselves were struggling to stay alive against the dampness that seeped in from every wall. The four of them sat close together, James, Clara, Rowan, and Elsie, eyes flickering between the firelight and the tall lodge windows, each pane rattling under the wind's unseen hand. The glass looked dark, too dark, as if something outside leaned close against it, refusing to be revealed. James broke the silence first, though his voice was quieter than usual, his natural authority cut down by unease. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel like we're being watched. Not just the way you feel when you're paranoid. No, something is out there." He tilted his head toward the windows, as though daring whatever lurked in the black woods to show itself. Clara hugged her knees, the fire's glow painting her pale face with warm light that did nothing to hide the tension in her expression. "The forest was wrong when we came in," she whispered. "It's not just the storm. It feels like this place doesn't want us here. The trees, they bent when the wind touched them, but not like trees should bend. They swayed like they were moving on their own." Rowan shifted uncomfortably, brushing damp hair from his forehead. He had spent years hiking, camping, and living in the wild, but the way his knuckles whitened around the mug in his hand told a different story. "I thought I saw something when I went to get firewood earlier," he admitted. "A figure between the trees. Tall. At first I thought it was just a trunk, but then the lightning came, and for a split second I could swear it had a face. A face without eyes." The fire popped, a sharp crack that made all four of them jolt. Elsie, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke, her voice steady but low, as if she were trying not to disturb something already listening. "My grandmother told me stories about forests like this," she said. "She said there are places where the land remembers things that happen there, terrible things, and it keeps them alive. The people who wander too close don't always come back. And the ones who do, they're not the same." Her words hung in the room like smoke, curling into their lungs and settling heavy in their stomachs. James shook his head sharply, as though trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread. "We're exhausted. We'll sleep, and in the morning the storm will clear. We'll make our way out." But his certainty was hollow, and they all heard it. The rain lashed harder against the windows, and the sound of wind in the forest took on an unsettling rhythm, almost like a voice humming through the branches. None of them wanted to admit it, but every minute that passed made it harder to tell the difference between weather and whisper, between storm and something else. As the fire dwindled, shadows crawled higher along the walls, and the air grew colder despite the heat. Then, faintly, there was another sound, just beneath the roar of the rain. A knock. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the wood of the door. They all froze, staring at each other in wide-eyed silence. Another knock followed, louder, as though whatever stood outside was not asking permission but demanding entry. James rose first, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth. "Stay back," he hissed, though his voice trembled despite his effort. The knocking grew more insistent, each thud rattling the frame of the lodge, shaking dust from the rafters. The four of them stared at the door, the fire casting wild shapes across their faces, hearts pounding in unison with the blows from outside. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence afterward was even worse. Elsie leaned closer to the fire, her whisper barely audible. "It knows we're here." The rain had slowed but never fully stopped, clinging to the world like a stubborn shadow. Each droplet that slipped from the eaves of the old lodge seemed louder than it should have been, echoing unnaturally in the otherwise oppressive quiet. The fire had dwindled down to faint embers, casting only a dim, wavering glow that made the corners of the room stretch out darker than before. Nobody wanted to move, speak, or even shift in their seats. The silence had a weight to it now, pressing on their chests as though if one of them dared to break it, something lurking just beyond the threshold of sound would hear and come closer. Marcus rubbed his hands over his face and muttered something, though it was so faint that Claire wasn't sure if it was meant for them or himself. She caught only fragments, not natural, wrong kind of quiet. "It's waiting." His voice cracked at the last word, and he quickly cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet the other's eyes. "We need to decide. Do we wait until morning? Or do we leave now?" Claire shook her head before anyone could answer. "We can't leave. You saw what's out there. Those shadows in the trees, they weren't just tricks of the rain or the firelight." Her voice was firm, but her hands betrayed her, trembling against her knees. "If we run into the woods, we'll be blind. We'll walk straight into it." Eli glanced toward the window, where the storm-faded glass reflected a dull shimmer of the lodge interior. His jaw tightened as though he wanted to argue, but the truth was plain in his eyes. He knew she was right. He leaned back, listening to the faint crackle of rain on the roof, then exhaled slowly. "So what do we do? Just sit here like prey and wait for it to decide when it's hungry?" That word, prey, landed heavily in the room. The group shifted uncomfortably, each person fighting the urge to look toward the door, as though expecting something to burst through at any second. The silence stretched on, and in that stillness, they began to notice the sound again. Not footsteps this time. Not scratching. Something subtler. A deep, rhythmic pulse, like the slow beat of a drum muffled under layers of earth and rain. It wasn't consistent, sometimes fading almost to nothing, then returning stronger, closer. Claire pressed her palm flat against the wooden floor and felt it, a faint vibration beneath her skin. Her breath caught. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. One by one, they lowered their hands, and each face paled as they realized the same thing. The floor was trembling, ever so slightly, in time with that hollow thrum. "It's under us," Marcus said hoarsely, his eyes darting to the floorboards as though he could see through them. "It's not outside anymore." The word sent a ripple of panic through the group. Chairs scraped against the floor as people pushed back, moving away from the center of the room as though distance would save them. The fire gave a sudden pop, sending a shower of sparks upward, and for a split second the orange glow flared bright enough to reveal shapes dancing across the walls, shapes that didn't belong to any of them. Long, twisting figures, stretched and bent in impossible ways, as if the fire itself was trying to warn them. Claire forced herself to stand, even though her knees threatened to buckle. She raised her voice just enough to be heard over the growing sound beneath the lodge. "If it's under us, then this place isn't safe. We have to stay together, but we need to move, now." The group looked to her, fear swimming in their eyes, but also relief. It was easier to follow someone else than to stand frozen in indecision. Eli grabbed one of the lanterns from the wall, the glass cold against his hand, and lit it from the fire's embers. The warm glow spread across his features, but his expression remained grim. "Where?" he asked simply. Claire swallowed hard. The choices were grim. Upstairs, where the storm battered at the windows but at least the floor was solid beneath them. Or back outside into the rain-soaked woods that whispered with movement. She thought of the trail they had come from, swallowed now by mud and darkness, and shivered. "Upstairs," she decided. "If we can get high enough, maybe we'll understand what it wants, or at least see it coming." Marcus shook his head, muttering again, but he didn't argue. Nobody argued. The heavy thrum beneath the floor was growing stronger, rattling the wooden beams, dust drifting down from the ceiling. As they climbed the narrow staircase, Every creak seemed like a scream in the suffocating quiet. The lantern light flickered against the walls, revealing faded photographs of the lodge's past, hunters, loggers, families. In each picture, the eyes of the people seemed to glimmer unnaturally in the lamplight, watching them climb, as if waiting for something they all already knew was inevitable. When they reached the upper hall, the sound beneath them stopped. The silence returned, but it was not the kind of silence that comforted. It was the silence of something listening. By the time the group stumbled into the clearing, soaked through from the rain and worn down by the endless tangle of forest, the sight of the lodge felt almost unreal. It sat like a hulking shadow among the trees, its shape blurred in the mist and rain, its roof sagging under years of weight, and its windows reflecting only the dim flicker of lightning. The air smelled faintly of wet wood and something else, something acrid, like smoke that had seeped into the timber long ago and never left. For a long moment, no one moved. The forest pressed against them from all sides, and the downpour pattered steadily on the canopy above, trickling down their collars, soaking through their sleeves. Every instinct screamed that this place was not a refuge but a warning, yet the sheer exhaustion of the endless trek made the decision for them. They had no choice. The heavy door resisted at first, swollen from rain and warped from years of neglect, but with a hard shove it gave way, groaning loudly as if the lodge itself protested their arrival. The sound echoed into the wide interior, a hollow, unsettling resonance that felt too loud for the space. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, mildew, and the faint lingering scent of burned wood. Their footsteps stirred the dust into the air, making each breath gritty. The floorboards creaked under their weight, but the shelter was real. The roof held, the rain no longer fell on their heads, and the walls closed them off from the relentless forest. They lit the campfire in the main room, carefully coaxing the flame from damp logs they carried in their packs, until the fire sputtered to life, crackling and throwing out a weak, flickering light. Shadows stretched across the walls, bending and warping as if alive. The group circled the fire instinctively, huddled close for warmth. For a brief moment, the comfort of heat dulled their unease, and the sound of the rain pounding the roof even brought a fragile sense of safety. But then, as their eyes adjusted, details of the room began to emerge, and the illusion of comfort began to crumble. The walls were lined with shelves, most broken or collapsed, their contents scattered across the floor. Old lanterns, cracked mugs, and rusted tools lay half buried in dust. The far corner of the lodge held what looked like a set of chairs around a table, but the chairs were splintered, and the table was scorched black, as though someone had tried to set it alight long ago. Above the fireplace hung something that none of them wanted to look at too closely at first, a set of animal skulls nailed into the wall, arranged in a strange, uneven pattern. Their empty sockets stared down at the group with an almost deliberate malice. "Hunters," one of them muttered, though the explanation felt hollow, like a word thrown out to cover the silence rather than a truth anyone believed. The rain grew heavier, drumming harder against the roof, and the fire sputtered in protest. Every few seconds, the wind forced its way through the cracks in the walls, making the shadows ripple like something moving just out of reach. And in the rhythm of the storm, they all noticed it at once. There was another sound beneath it. A faint tapping. Not the rain. Not the wind. Something slower, more deliberate, almost like fingers drumming lightly against the wood of the outside walls. The group froze, staring at the door. The tapping stopped immediately, as though it had been listening, waiting for their attention. Then silence. No one dared breathe too loudly, and the fire seemed to shrink smaller, its glow dimming as though reacting to the tension in the air. They waited, the minutes dragging like hours, until one of them finally stood, pacing the room with restless energy. The tapping hadn't returned, but that didn't make the silence any safer. It only made it heavier. In the corner of the room, leaning against the wall, they discovered an old trunk, its wood darkened with water damage and age. Curiosity won out over fear, and they dragged it closer to the firelight, prying it open. Inside lay objects that seemed ordinary at first. A folded wool blanket, brittle with time, a collection of notebooks swollen from damp, and beneath it all, a bundle of small charred logs tied together with twine. But when one of them picked up the bundle, the twine broke apart, scattering the blackened wood across the floor. The pieces rolled, and it became clear these weren't logs at all. They were bones. Small bones. Too small to belong to any animal of the forest. The group recoiled, the discovery sending a wave of dread through them, yet no one said what they were all thinking. They only shoved the bones back into the trunk, closed it, and pushed it as far from the fire as they could. Outside, the rain roared louder than ever, like a wall of noise trying to block out the truth of where they were. That night, they tried to rest in shifts, but sleep came only in fragments. Every creak of the lodge, every moan of the storm, felt like something pressing against the walls. Some swore they heard footsteps pacing the porch outside, but when they dared to glance toward the window, there was only darkness, thick and endless. Others dreamed of fire and smoke, of hands clawing at the door from the outside, of voices whispering in the walls. And when dawn finally came, gray and bleak through the rain-streaked glass, they all looked worse than before. The lodge had given them shelter from the storm, but at a cost. It wasn't just a building. It was something else. Something waiting. The gray light of dawn spilled weakly through the cracked, rain-streaked windows, casting long, pale shadows across the lodge's warped floorboards. It gave the impression of clarity, of safety, but the air was still heavy with something unspoken, an almost tangible weight pressing down on them. Marcus moved first, dragging his chair closer to the fire pit to stoke the embers. His hands shook, and every movement seemed to echo unnaturally in the empty lodge. Claire and Eli watched him, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Even the steady tapping of the rain on the roof seemed to carry a note of warning now, like a countdown, counting their hearts instead of the storm. The floorboards groaned beneath them as they began to move around, trying to stretch the stiffness out of their limbs. Then, very faintly at first, Claire noticed it, a subtle vibration like something deep beneath the floor shifting under their weight. At first, she dismissed it as old wood reacting to the wet, cold morning air. But the vibration persisted, and soon Marcus noticed it too, stopping mid-motion with a frown. "Do you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice low. Her fingers pressed against the floor, trying to gauge the tremor. Eli knelt beside her, placing a hand flat on the boards. The wood was humming, vibrating ever so slightly, in a slow, steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. "It's the floor," Eli said, though his voice carried more uncertainty than conviction. "Must be weak beams or water damage or something." "No," Marcus whispered, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "This isn't random. It's deliberate." The group froze, straining to hear over the rain and the fire. And then it came, the first distinct sound, unmistakable and deliberate, a slow, scraping step, deep and hollow, moving across the boards of the upper floor. The vibration intensified, the rhythm growing, echoing through the lodge like the footsteps of a giant crawling beneath the floor. Claire's skin prickled, goosebumps racing along her arms. "It's upstairs," she said softly, though a tremor betrayed the edge in her voice. Something is moving up there." Eli swallowed hard. "Or it's under the lodge. Maybe in the basement? Or..." He stopped. No one wanted to voice what he feared, that it didn't belong to the human world at all. Marcus grabbed the lantern and held it higher, the weak light shivering across the floor. "We have to see," he said. "We can't just wait here. If it's moving under the lodge, we need to know what it is before it decides to make its next move." Claire hesitated but finally nodded. The group began moving carefully toward the stairs that led to the upper floor. Every step creaked sharply, loud against the hum of rain, and the footsteps above or below seemed to pause as if aware of their approach. The hallway stretched ahead of them, shadows pooling thickly in the corners. The air smelled damp, moldy, and faintly metallic, as though the walls themselves had soaked up old blood. When they reached the top landing, the footsteps began again, moving with a slow, rhythmic pace. There was a scrape, a dragging sound, then a sudden pause as if something had stopped to watch them. Eli whispered, "It knows we're here." They pressed forward, creeping down the narrow hallway lined with doors that leaned on their hinges, some barely holding onto their frames. The floorboards groaned under the weight of their careful movements, betraying them with every step. At the end of the hall, a single door stood slightly ajar, blackness spilling from the gap inside. The footsteps had stopped. The room beyond seemed empty, except for the faintest trace of movement in the shadows. Claire swallowed hard. "Should we open it?" Marcus hesitated, then reached for the knob. His hand was shaking, and the lantern cast long, distorted shadows behind them. Slowly, deliberately, he turned the handle. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness, its walls covered with long, jagged scratches, gouged deep into the wood. The air was colder here, denser, pressing against their chests with each breath. Then, from the corner of the room, a faint rustling sound echoed, soft, deliberate, and yet impossibly fast. Something shifted in the shadows. Claire's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might give her away. The lantern's light flickered violently, and when it steadied, the room seemed empty. But it wasn't. The floor beneath them vibrated once more, and this time the movement wasn't subtle. It shook the boards as though something massive had landed beneath, something that didn't belong. A low, resonant hum began to fill the room, rising in pitch until it felt like it was rattling their bones. Marcus stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. "It's..." he started, but the words died in his throat. The shadows in the corners shifted, elongating, stretching toward the door. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. Silence fell like a blade. The only sound remaining was the soft, insistent tapping of rain against the windows, but even that seemed distant now, muffled by the weight of the thing in the lodge with them. Claire swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "We need to leave. Now, before it decides we're food." Eli shook his head. "We can't just run blindly. We need a plan." His eyes darted around the room. "But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with." And somewhere deep below, hidden in the foundation of the lodge, the thing moved again. The four of them stood frozen at the top of the staircase, the air thick and cold as though the lodge itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. Every hair on Claire's arms stood on end, and even Marcus, usually steady in emergencies, felt the tremor in his legs. The rhythmic thrum beneath their feet had returned, slower now, almost patient, like the pulse of something waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Eli gripped the lantern tighter, its flickering light barely cutting through the darkness, casting trembling shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls. "Do you feel that?" Claire whispered, her voice nearly lost in the press of silence. The others nodded. The floorboards shivered beneath them again, not random, not weak, too deliberate, too heavy to be structural. Something was moving below them. Something that had been waiting. Marcus stepped forward, testing the first step toward the hall. It groaned, an exaggerated creak that seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the house were amplifying his every motion. Then, from beneath, came a low scraping, a slow, dragging sound that set every nerve in his body on edge. The vibration was heavier now, the pulse sharper. Claire's stomach dropped. It felt like the floor itself was breathing, alive, aware. "We can't stay here," she hissed, pressing herself against the wall. "It's under us. We need to move, now." Eli swallowed hard, scanning the hallway with the lantern. The doors leaned slightly off their hinges, dark gaps that seemed to breathe in the flickering light. Each shadow stretched unnaturally, as if the corners of the lodge had begun to grow independently, reaching, grasping. "We can't just run blindly. We need to stick together." The group edged forward, feet light on the boards, every sound amplified by the oppressive quiet. The staircase behind them creaked ominously, reminding them of the open air outside, the rain-soaked forest that had felt threatening but at least predictable. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the lodge had already trapped them, its walls pressing closer with every heartbeat. As they reached the end of the hallway, the faintest scratching sound began behind them, not high above, not in front, but from the very boards beneath their feet. Claire froze, feeling the vibration in the soles of her shoes. Marcus stopped next to her, lantern held high. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic drag that seemed to trace every step they had taken. And then, a new noise, soft at first, almost imperceptible, a whispering that didn't belong to any human tongue. The words were broken, scattered, like the echoes of something calling to them from beneath the lodge, seeping through the floorboards like mist. Eli leaned closer to one of the doors, squinting into the darkness beyond. He gasped. The shadow inside stretched, flickering in the lantern's glow, twisting as though it had no boundaries. It reached outward, tendrils of darkness crawling along the walls, creeping toward the center of the hallway. The whispers grew louder, layering over each other until the four of them could no longer distinguish between sound and thought. Claire pressed herself against the wall, trembling. "It's here," she whispered. "It knows where we are. It can feel us." Marcus swallowed hard. "We have to keep moving. Follow me." He led them carefully down the hallway, every step a battle against the floorboards that threatened to betray them. With each motion, the hum beneath grew, rising in pitch and intensity. It was no longer subtle. It filled the lodge, vibrating through their bones, rattling the lantern in Eli's hand. The shadows along the walls grew longer, sharper, taking forms that were vaguely humanoid but impossibly twisted, stretching toward them with intent. As they reached the first door on the left, a sudden crash made them all jump. The lantern swung violently, its light cutting across the room to reveal a chair lying on its side in the middle of the hall. The whispers crescendoed into a roar, echoing in the lodge as though the walls themselves had joined in, chanting their names without words. Claire's stomach lurched. The floorboards beneath them shuddered violently, and something cold and sharp grazed her ankle, almost like a clawed finger brushing just under the wood. Eli stepped back instinctively and Marcus grabbed his arm. "We're not safe here," he said, his voice tight with panic. "We have to reach the attic. We'll be above it." We'll see what it wants. Claire nodded reluctantly, eyes darting to the far end of the hall where a narrow staircase led upward. The shadows stretched toward them as they moved, a tangible weight pressing in. Every step was an effort, a battle against the oppressive darkness, the whispers and the tremors beneath their feet. They could feel the presence everywhere now, a massive force pressing up from under the lodge, patient, hungry, and aware. The stairs loomed ahead like a tunnel into the unknown. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound beneath the floor intensified, a low, guttural vibration that felt like the heartbeat of a predator, calling them forward, daring them to continue. Claire's breath came in short, ragged gasps, and she could feel the sweat trickling down her back despite the chill. As they reached the attic door, a sudden, deafening crack split the air. The floorboards behind them buckled slightly, and a long, shadowy tendril shot out from the darkness below, snaking toward them with unnatural speed. Claire screamed, and Marcus slammed the attic door shut just as the tendril brushed the soles of their boots. The sound of it scraping and dragging across the hall floor faded, but the vibrations beneath remained, thrumming like an unrelenting drumbeat. They leaned against the attic door, chest heaving, lantern shaking in Eli's hand. The whispers had quieted, replaced by the low, steady vibration beneath them. The lodge waited, patient, hungry, and above all, it was aware. The attic door creaked as Marcus forced it open, the lantern light spilling into the small, cramped space. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by their entrance, and the smell hit them immediately, a pungent mix of damp wood, decay, and something far more elusive, like iron and rot intertwined. The ceiling sloped low, forcing them to bend slightly, and the rafters above cast jagged shadows that danced in the lantern's weak glow. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, a hidden watcher waiting for them to make the wrong move. Claire stepped cautiously, brushing her hand against the wall. The wood was rough, splintered in places, and she could feel deep gouges etched into it, some jagged and fresh-looking, some long-aged and brittle. The scratching seemed almost intentional, leading their eyes toward a far wall where a trunk sat half-hidden beneath a threadbare tarp. Eli was the first to reach it. He lifted the tarp carefully, revealing a collection of objects that belonged to someone, or something, that had occupied the attic long ago. Candles, mostly melted down to stubs, lined one edge. A set of notebooks lay stacked unevenly, their covers warped by moisture. Claire picked one up, the paper brittle beneath her fingertips, and flicked through the pages. Symbols, drawn in jagged, almost frantic strokes, covered every surface. Triangular shapes interlocked with circles, lines radiating outward like claws, and each page was annotated with a hand that seemed to tremble as it wrote. She shivered. The writing wasn't human, or if it was, it had been created by someone who had spent too long in darkness. Marcus leaned over another pile in the trunk. Small wooden carvings, animalistic and grotesque, stared up at them with hollow eyes. Some resembled deer, others bears, but all were twisted, elongated, with spindly limbs and gaping mouths. The carvings had been scorched slightly, blackened edges hinting at fire that had passed through long ago. And yet, despite the decay, they seemed almost aware, as if their tiny carved heads followed the group's movements across the room. Who would do this? Claire whispered, her voice cracking. Why would someone fill an attic like this? Eli didn't answer at first. He knelt beside the trunk, picking up a small leather-bound book that seemed older than the rest. Its pages were stained, brittle, and they smelled of something foul, blood or rust or worse. Opening it, he revealed careful writing in a script neither of them could read aloud without faltering. But among the symbols, one thing was clear: sketches of the lodge itself, drawn as if it were alive. The walls twisted in the sketches, spiraling upward, while figures moved unnaturally across the floors. And in every illustration, a dark mass lurked beneath, coiling like smoke around the foundation. Marcus ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. This has been going on for years. Whoever lived here, or whatever lived here, knew the lodge wasn't just a building. They knew it could trap you, shape you, change you. Claire's eyes fell on the far corner of the attic, where a small trapdoor, almost hidden behind old beams, stood slightly ajar. A faint draft moved through the opening, carrying a chill that raised goosebumps along her arms. "What's under there?" she whispered. Eli approached slowly, lantern held high. The darkness beyond the trapdoor seemed to pulse, as if alive, breathing softly in rhythm with the vibrations they had felt earlier. He knelt and peered inside, the beam of light illuminating rough, uneven stone walls that descended into darkness. A cold, damp smell rose up from the depths. The hum beneath the lodge was louder here, almost deafening, vibrating through the wooden floor, through their bones. Marcus shook his head. No, we shouldn't. But Claire couldn't turn away. Something about that trapdoor called to her, whispered to her in a voice she didn't recognize, tugging at her fear and curiosity alike. Her hand hovered over the edge of the wood, trembling. The vibrations beneath her feet pulsed in response, stronger, deliberate. Something was waiting down there. Something that had been patient for decades. A sudden crash from the main floor startled them all. The lantern swung wildly in Eli's hands, throwing grotesque shadows across the attic walls. The vibration beneath the floorboard intensified, a deep, resonant thrum that shook the entire attic. The whispers returned, this time a chorus, echoing through the rafters, unintelligible, urgent, demanding attention. Claire's breath caught. It knows we're here. And somewhere below, in the bowels of the lodge, something moved. The attic seemed to close in around them, the rafters leaning lower as if pressing against their shoulders, compressing the air with the weight of decades of silence and waiting. Claire's hand trembled over the trapdoor, drawn to the darkness beneath it like a magnet. The vibrations in the floorboards had grown, pulsing in a slow, heavy rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat, one that did not belong to any of them. The whispers had intensified, overlapping, now clearly voices, but not human ones. They were layered, fragmented, urgent, like dozens of mouths speaking in different tones, some raspy, some high-pitched, all chanting together in a language that clawed at the edges of their minds. Marcus swallowed hard, his knuckles white on the lantern handle. "This is a bad idea," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could feel the pull of the trapdoor, the way the darkness seemed to call directly to him. Eli, standing beside him, nodded reluctantly, tightening his grip on the lantern. "We can't just stay here," he said. "Whatever's down there, it's the source. It's what's been haunting this lodge. If we don't face it, I don't think anything else will stop it." Claire took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and finally forced her hand to press against the trapdoor's edge. It swung upward smoothly, almost too smoothly, revealing a narrow stairwell leading down into utter blackness. The smell hit them immediately, a mixture of damp stone, rot, and something metallic, coppery, like blood that had soaked into the walls decades ago. The air was colder here, and every breath they took seemed to carry a shiver down their spines. The floor beneath the stairs vibrated even more violently than before, a pulsing rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of a predator. The voices below now called more clearly, whispers overlapping with guttural growls and sudden shrieks, echoing through the stone stairwell. Claire's stomach twisted, but curiosity and necessity overpowered fear. She stepped forward first, lantern raised, its light trembling across the damp stone steps. One by one, the others followed, moving slowly and deliberately. Every creak of the wooden stairs above them, every thump of a foot on stone, seemed magnified, and the air grew heavier the deeper they descended. Shadows shifted at the edges of their vision, but whenever they tried to look directly, nothing was there, just walls, damp and cracked, and darkness deeper than any night they had ever known. About halfway down, the whispering became intelligible, though the words were still not human. Their minds grasped fragments. "Leave, you belong, feed." The air thickened, and the floor beneath their boots vibrated in short, sudden pulses now, as if the lodge itself were warning them. One wrong step, one faltering heartbeat, and it would claim them. Eli shivered. "This isn't a basement. A nest. Something lives down here. Something that's been building this hunger for years." He glanced at the others. "We need to keep moving." No hesitation. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a chamber larger than they expected, walls hewn from rough stone, slick with moisture and staining darkly with old, dried blood. The chamber's center held a pit, carved into the stone, black and endless. A faint, oily mist rose from its depths, swirling and curling toward them as if tasting the air. The pulsing vibrations were strongest here, vibrating through their bones, throbbing in time with the chaotic chorus of whispers. Claire's lantern light caught something at the edge of the pit, something coiled, dark, and massive, only partially visible. It shifted as if aware of their presence, a living shadow that moved with deliberate patience. The whispers rose in volume, forming words she could barely comprehend. "Closer, closer, your blood, your fear, our feast." Marcus pointed at the pit, his voice low and trembling. That's what's been under the lodge all along. That's the heart of it. That's the thing controlling this place." Eli swallowed hard, looking down at the black, swirling mass. "And it's hungry," he said simply. "It's been feeding on everything that came before us, and now, it wants us." The floorboards at the chamber's edge creaked violently. Something massive shifted beneath them, unseen but undeniable. Dust and small stones fell from the ceiling as the air pressure changed, like the chamber itself was inhaling, preparing for something immense. The whispers became a roar, rising to a deafening pitch, and the shadows in the corners of the chamber stretched upward, reaching toward the ceiling and toward the four of them. Claire swallowed hard, gripping Marcus's arm. "We can't stop now," she said. We have to face it." Eli nodded, voice barely a whisper. "We either face it here or we die trying to escape this lodge." Marcus looked at the pit, then down at the darkness swirling within. "Step carefully," he warned. "It can feel us. It can reach for us." And as they took their first tentative steps toward the pit, the black mist began to surge, curling and twisting like living smoke. Shapes started to form within it, long, spindly limbs, eyes glowing faintly red, gaping mouths opening in silent screams. The chamber seemed to pulse with a life of its own, breathing, alive, hungry. The lodge, it seemed, had waited for this moment for decades. And now, in the deep, black heart beneath its floorboards, the four of them faced the hunger that had been waiting, patient, eternal, and utterly merciless. The black mist swirled thicker as the four of them edged closer to the pit, tendrils of darkness slithering across the damp stone like living smoke, curling toward their legs and ankles. Every step they took seemed to provoke it, and the air itself vibrated with a low, resonant hum that pressed against their bones, making their hearts hammer in unison. The lantern's flickering light barely pierced the gloom. Shadows twisted in impossible ways, stretching along the walls, bending over corners, coiling in on themselves. The lodge was alive beneath them, aware, patient, and ready. Claire swallowed hard, gripping Marcus's arm. The whispers had grown louder, layered now with guttural growls and faint human-like cries that echoed from deep below the pit. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. It's calling to us, naming us." Eli shivered. "It knows our names, it knows our fear." He took a tentative step closer, peering into the pit. The mist had begun to take shape, vague, humanoid forms emerging and dissolving again, faces with hollow sockets, mouths opening in silent screams. The very air seemed to resist their presence, pressing against their skin, their lungs burning with effort as they inhaled. Marcus took a deep breath. "We have to see it fully. That's the only way to know what we're dealing with." He took the first step toward the edge of the pit, careful not to disturb the surrounding stone, and the black mist recoiled slightly as if noticing the intrusion. The vibrations intensified, sending a shiver through the floorboards above. Claire followed, her knees weak, every instinct screaming to turn back. The shadows seemed to reach for her, brushing against her shoulders, trailing icy fingers across her neck. She swallowed hard, forcing herself forward, her lantern casting wavering light across shapes that were impossible to fully comprehend. Eyes glimmered faintly within the darkness. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, watching, waiting, unblinking. Eli leaned over the pit, trying to focus. The mist was thick now, and he could barely make out the outline of something immense at the center. It shifted slowly, deliberately, as though aware of their gaze, rising and falling like a tidal wave frozen in time. Shapes extended from it, tentacle-like forms curling and twisting toward the four of them, each movement purposeful, predatory. Suddenly, one of the tendrils lashed out, striking the floor mere inches from Marcus's boot. The stone splintered where it hit, tiny shards bouncing back at them, and the mist recoiled with a hiss like a living thing angered by their presence. The whispers turned into a chorus of screams, layered voices shouting incomprehensible words, some high-pitched and frantic, some low and guttural, vibrating the very air around them. Claire stumbled backward, nearly falling against Eli. It's testing us," she cried. "It wants to see how we react." Marcus steadied himself and forced his voice over the rising chaos. "Stay focused. We need to understand it or we're done. We can't let it control us with fear." Eli gritted his teeth, holding the lantern steady. "It's not just fear," he said. "It feeds on hesitation, on doubt. If we falter, if we show weakness, it will take us." The mist shifted again, coiling upward, taller now, forming a dark mass that reached near the rafters. Claire caught glimpses of its form, limbs twisted and long, spindly fingers ending in points that scraped the air, faces appearing and disappearing across its surface, mouths opening in silent, impossible screams. The very walls of the lodge seemed to bend inward, as if the building itself were collapsing toward the pit, compressing them in a tightening spiral. Then came movement from the shadows along the chamber walls. Figures detached themselves from the darkness, humanoid yet impossibly warped, elongated arms stretching toward the group. Claire froze as one reached for her, brushing her shoulder with an icy touch. The fingers left a trail of cold that penetrated to her bones. She screamed, flinching back, but Marcus grabbed her arm, steadying her. "It's not just down there," Marcus said grimly. "It's all around us. The lodge, it's alive. Every shadow, every floorboard, every wall, it's feeding this thing. And it's aware of us." Eli took a deep breath, his jaw tight. "Then we face it together. No hesitation, no fear. We see it, we understand it, or we don't survive this lodge." The black mass in the pit shifted again, rising higher now, tendrils stretching, faces forming and dissolving, mouths opening to release whispers that cut into their minds. The air was thick with the smell of iron and decay. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape, but the stairwell behind them had vanished into shadows, as if the lodge had swallowed it. There was no going back. Only forward, into the darkness, into the heart of the thing that had haunted this place for decades. Claire raised her lantern higher, casting trembling light directly into the center of the pit. And finally she saw it. The heart of the lodge. A mass of darkness, writhing, coiling, with countless eyes opening across its surface, staring directly at them. Faces twisted in silent screams formed and disappeared, some looking painfully human, others grotesque beyond comprehension. The whispers became words, insistent, urgent: "Come closer, belong, feed, stay." The four of them stood at the edge of the pit, breath ragged, hearts hammering, the darkness stretching toward them like a living thing, alive with memory, hunger, and rage. The lodge itself seemed to pulse in time with it, the vibrations beneath their feet thrumming like a heartbeat of a predator, waiting for the moment to strike. And the first tendril lashed out. The tendril lashed out faster than their minds could follow, curling like black smoke and striking at Marcus with an unnatural precision. He stumbled backward, slamming his shoulder into the stone wall, the lantern skidding from his grip and plunging part of the attic into darkness. Claire screamed, reaching for his arm, but another tendril whipped past her, brushing her shoulder with a cold that felt like ice creeping into her bones. The black mass in the pit rippled, reacting to their fear, its countless eyes opening wider, glowing faintly red in the flickering light. Eli lunged for the lantern, finally grabbing it and held it high. Its feeble glow revealed the shadows along the chamber walls moving independently, stretching toward them, faces forming, mouths opening in silent, terrifying screams. The whispers had become a roar, a cacophony of voices layered one atop another, some sounding human, some monstrous, all insistent: "Closer, belong, feed, stay." Marcus forced himself to his feet, gasping for breath. We can't let it overwhelm us," he shouted, though the words felt hollow against the oppressive darkness. "Keep moving. Don't show fear." Claire shook, but she nodded, gripping his arm. They edged closer to the pit, feeling the vibrations beneath their feet grow more intense. The black mass in the center seemed to sense their defiance, coiling upward, tendrils whipping outward, brushing the walls and the four of them, leaving trails of icy cold and a faint metallic tang in the air. The shadows along the walls now moved with purpose, converging toward the pit, merging with the dark mist, reinforcing the presence that had waited here for decades. Eli shone the lantern directly into the pit again. The swirling darkness was no longer merely a mass, it had begun to take form. Long, jagged limbs emerged from the blackness, ending in clawed hands, some grasping, others slashing. Faces formed along its surface, distorted human visages, mouths opening in eternal screams, eyes staring blankly yet somehow piercingly at them. The whispers had grown into a chorus that clawed at their minds, infiltrating their thoughts, whispering fears and doubts. "Leave. We are your end. You cannot escape." Claire's knees buckled under the weight of fear. We have to fight it," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her words rang with determination, a fragile light against the consuming darkness. "We have to face it or it will destroy us." Marcus gritted his teeth, gripping the edge of the pit. "Together. Stick together. Don't let it isolate us." The mass reacted instantly, a tendril lashing out and knocking the lantern from Eli's hands. The light fell across the chamber, flickering and dancing across the walls, revealing more of the shadows that lurked in every corner. One reached for Marcus again, wrapping around his leg, tugging him dangerously close to the pit. The cold bite of the darkness crept up his body, slowing his movements, threatening to pull him into the void. Claire lunged, grabbing his arm, and together they stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the edge. Eli recovered the lantern, holding it high once more. Its glow illuminated the center of the pit fully now, revealing the true scale of the entity. Its mass was enormous, a writhing shadow that filled the chamber, stretching upward and outward, tendrils wrapping around the walls, almost merging with the lodge itself. The faces across its surface twisted and shifted, some seeming to scream directly at them, others whispering in voices only they could hear. The vibration beneath their feet had become a deafening pulse, like the heartbeat of a creature that had waited centuries for intruders. Suddenly, one of the tendrils shot upward with terrifying speed, smashing against the ceiling rafters. The wood splintered and cracked, pieces raining down. Dust and debris filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Claire coughed, shielding her eyes, but she could see the darkness shifting and moving, almost intelligent in its motions, studying them, reacting to their fear, their hesitation. Marcus shook his head, forcing himself to focus. "We have to act," he shouted. "It's testing us, but it's not invincible. We have to find its center, its heart." Eli nodded, eyes wide but determined. "It's here under the lodge. This pit, the shadows, it's all part of it. If we destroy it, maybe the lodge will die too." Claire swallowed, nodding. She felt the tendrils brushing against her again, cold and probing, testing her resolve. She raised a hand, trembling, and struck one with the lantern, the flame flickering wildly. The entity shrieked, not in sound but in the vibration and pressure that pressed against their minds. The shadows writhed in response, faces dissolving and reappearing in a chaotic swirl. The four of them took a synchronized step forward, pressing toward the pit together. The mass reacted instantly, tendrils snapping outward, striking at them, but they moved as one, dodging, weaving, and advancing. The chamber seemed to pulse in time with the entity, walls groaning, floorboards trembling violently, shadows leaping and merging with the darkness below. Claire's voice rang out over the chaos. "We have to get to the center. Don't stop, don't hesitate." And with a final, horrifying motion, the darkness surged upward, the pit seeming to expand, tendrils whipping outward in a desperate attempt to consume them. But the four of them, hearts pounding, lungs burning, pressed forward, lanterns held high, their fear now sharpened into determination. The entity roared through the vibrations, through the whispers, through the very walls, and for the first time, it seemed almost afraid. The lodge trembled as though anticipating what would come next. The black mass writhed, a living storm of shadow and rage, and the four of them stood at the edge of the pit, ready to confront the heart of the lodge itself. The black mass surged violently as if sensing their intent, tendrils whipping outward and smashing against the stone walls, leaving deep gouges and splintered wood. The air grew colder, thick with the metallic tang of blood, and the whispers had become a deafening roar, vibrating directly into their skulls. The chamber itself seemed alive, walls breathing, floorboards quivering like frightened animals, shadows leaping from every corner, merging with the darkness below. Claire's hands shook as she gripped the lantern, its light wavering like a pulse against the oppressive gloom. Marcus was the first to step forward toward the edge of the pit, his boots pressed firmly against the damp stone. "We need to go deeper," he shouted over the roar of whispers, though his voice trembled. "If we don't reach its core, it'll tear us apart." Eli grabbed his shoulder. "Be careful. One wrong move and—" His warning ended abruptly as a tendril shot upward, striking the floor where Marcus had stood moments before. The stone splintered under the strike, sending dust and debris into the air. The darkness recoiled only slightly, as if savoring the game, testing their resolve, feeding on their fear. Claire felt the icy brush of another tendril along her back, freezing her in place. The sensation was like 1,000 needles, each one probing deeper, burrowing into her mind, pulling at memories she had long tried to bury. Faces formed in the mist around her, friends, strangers, distorted reflections of herself, screaming silently, their mouths moving, whispering her fears aloud. She staggered but forced herself forward, teeth gritted, refusing to give the darkness even a hint of victory. Eli swung the lantern at the nearest tendril, flames flickering, shadows dancing across the walls. The creature recoiled from the firelight, its shrieks echoing through the chamber in a vibration that rattled their bones. "It doesn't like the light," he yelled. "We have to keep it away from us." Marcus and Claire exchanged a glance and nodded. Together, they pressed to the edge of the pit, eyes scanning for the entity's heart. The mass writhed, black tendrils reaching outward, faces forming, dissolving, writhing in agony and rage. Some appeared human, others twisted beyond comprehension, eyes glowing dim red. The chamber shook violently as if the lodge itself was alive and in pain, the roof groaning under the pressure of some ancient, malevolent will. Suddenly, from the shadows near the far wall, something moved independently, faster than anything else. A figure, tall, thin, its limbs elongated and bending in unnatural angles, emerged. Its eyes glowed a deep crimson, and its face split into a silent scream. It lunged at Marcus, hands outstretched, fingers clawed and tipped with shadows that seemed to pierce reality itself. Marcus stumbled, barely dodging the attack, scraping his shoulder on the stone wall. He yelled, pain shooting through him, adrenaline surging as he swung a wooden beam he had grabbed from the rafters. The figure recoiled, hissing, and merged back into the swirling black mist at the center of the pit. The vibrations beneath their feet intensified, pulsing like the heartbeat of a predator preparing to strike. Eli's lantern flickered violently, threatening to go out, and the whispers, voices of the lost, the damned, the long dead, rose to a deafening crescendo. Come, closer, belong, feed. Claire leaned over the edge of the pit, trying to make sense of the mass. Among the writhing shadows, a central core began to form. It was darker than the black mist surrounding it, dense, almost solid, pulsing with energy. Red eyes formed across its surface, blinking in unison as if acknowledging them individually. The mass writhed violently, tendrils whipping in every direction, some striking the walls, some lashing toward them, but none daring to touch the center of the pit directly. That's it, Claire whispered, pointing. The heart, that's what's controlling everything. If we destroy it, maybe the lodge, maybe it'll stop. Eli nodded, gripping the lantern higher. We need to hit it. Together. No hesitation. He glanced at Marcus and Claire, determination etched into his face despite the terror surrounding them. On three. 1, 2, 3. They moved as one. Claire swung a wooden beam she had grabbed, striking a tendril as it whipped past her. Marcus followed, his fist connecting with another tendril, breaking it with a sickening snap. Eli thrust the lantern forward, flames licking the core, causing it to recoil, shrieking in a vibration that shook the chamber. The black mass writhed violently, twisting and turning, tendrils lashing in a frenzy. Faces in the mist screamed silently, eyes glowing, mouths opening impossibly wide. Suddenly, the core pulsed brighter, a wave of darkness exploding outward, knocking them all back against the chamber walls. Dust and debris rained down as the floorboards quaked violently, cracks forming in the stone beneath their feet. The air grew impossibly cold, breaths freezing in their lungs. The lodge groaned as if alive, its walls creaking, its beams bending under the pressure. Claire gasped, struggling to her feet. She could see it now, directly in the center of the pit, the heart pulsing, tendrils whipping like furious snakes, shadows crawling up the walls, and the whispers had become a deafening, manic chorus. We have to hit it harder, she shouted, adrenaline surging. Marcus and Eli nodded, grabbing what they could, wooden beams, pieces of broken furniture, and together they hurled everything into the pit. The items struck the core, splintering and catching fire. Flames erupted, licking the blackness, causing it to recoil and scream in a vibration that shook the very air. Tendrils lashed wildly, but the core pulsed weaker now, the eyes flickering and fading one by one. For a brief moment, the chamber fell silent. The lodge quaked one last time, shadows writhed as if resisting, then the black mist began to collapse inward, drawn toward the pit, shrinking, coiling upon itself. The whispers became faint, the vibration beneath their feet less intense. The heart of the lodge was weakening. Claire, Marcus, and Eli pressed closer, lanterns high, watching as the black mass writhed one final time before collapsing into a pile of smoldering mist. The chamber fell silent, save for the faint drip of water from the rafters and the distant patter of rain outside. The lodge itself seemed to exhale, a slow, almost mournful sigh. They stood in the dim light, breaths ragged, hearts hammering, the weight of what they had faced pressing down upon them. The entity that had haunted the lodge for decades, that had fed on fear, hesitation, and doubt, was gone, or at least diminished. The shadows retreated, the walls no longer seemed alive, and the pit lay dark and empty, no sign of the heart that had dominated this space. Claire whispered, voice trembling, Is it over? Marcus shook his head slowly, still tense. I don't know, but for now, it's gone. Eli lowered the lantern, scanning the chamber carefully. We survived, but the lodge, it's not done yet. Places like this don't forget. They wait. They watch. We need to leave, now, before it decides otherwise. The three of them turned toward the attic stairs, their limbs aching, minds racing, but their survival instinct stronger than ever. Behind them, the pit lay quiet, the black heart collapsed into nothing but shadows and lingering whispers that faded slowly into silence. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but for the first time since arriving, it felt less threatening, almost cleansing. Yet the lodge remained, silent, waiting, and they knew, deep down, that its heart might one day awaken again. The rain outside had intensified, hammering against the lodge's roof like a chorus of drumming fingers, each strike a reminder that the forest around them was as relentless as the darkness they had just faced. Claire, Marcus, and Eli stood at the top of the attic stairs, lanterns held high, peering down into the dim hallway. The lodge was eerily silent now, but the air still carried the weight of what had occurred. The scent of damp stone, scorched wood, and iron lingered, thick and metallic, clinging to their clothes and hair. Every creak of the floorboards under their feet echoed through the hall like a warning, reminding them that the lodge's walls had ears, that it had not entirely forgotten their presence. "Keep moving," Marcus urged, his voice low but firm. "Don't stop until we're outside. Don't look back." Claire nodded, swallowing hard. Her legs were trembling, but determination pushed her forward. Every shadow along the walls seemed to flicker unnaturally, lingering longer than it should, stretching toward them as they descended the stairs. Even though the entity in the pit had collapsed, the lodge itself seemed restless, as though it had absorbed a fragment of its heart and waited silently, biding its time for the next opportunity. Eli led the way to the main hall, lantern light cutting through the oppressive darkness. Debris from the earlier tremors littered the floor, splintered wood, stones, fragments of plaster, but the hallway felt less hostile than the attic. Yet every instinct told them that the lodge was still watching, still alive. They could hear faint whispers, almost subliminal, trailing behind them in echoes, teasing the edge of comprehension. "You cannot leave, not yet, we remember." As they neared the main entrance, Claire paused, hearing movement behind them. Something slid across the wooden floor, soft, deliberate, almost intelligent. Marcus froze and held up a hand, listening. A whisper brushed against the back of Claire's mind, fleeting yet distinct. "Stay, forever." Eli's eyes darted around, scanning the hallway. "It's not the entity anymore," he said grimly. "It's the lodge itself. The place is alive. It reacts to us, to fear. We can't give it any reason to hold us." They pressed forward, careful to avoid loose floorboards that creaked ominously. The rain outside offered some comfort, its persistent hammering masking the faint groans and whispers emanating from the lodge's walls. The main hall stretched before them, a long corridor lined with doors that seemed ordinary, yet their edges were warped subtly as if bending toward the intruders. The shadows along the walls grew longer, flickering in response to their movements, reaching for them, brushing across their arms and legs, yet never fully touching. Claire's heartbeat thumped violently in her chest. "Do you think it's following us?" she whispered. Marcus shook his head. "Not the entity, but the lodge. It remembers every footstep, every thought, every fear we had. It holds them. We have to get outside before it decides to act again." Eli led them to the main door. It was slightly ajar, letting in the relentless rain and the smell of wet pine and soil. As they pushed it open fully, a gust of wind blew inside, scattering dust and debris across the floor. For a brief moment, the oppressive darkness seemed to recoil, the shadows shrinking back as if the storm itself offered them protection. But the relief was fleeting. The lodge groaned, a low, resonant sound vibrating through the walls, almost like a sigh of irritation. Stepping into the rain-soaked forest, their boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground, they felt an immediate sense of relief, yet the shadows still clung to the edges of their vision. The forest was dark, but familiar in a way the lodge never was. Raindrops poured down, masking the whispers that tried to reach them, carrying them away with the wind. Trees swayed violently, branches whipping through the night, yet there was no immediate threat here that they could see. Claire paused to look back at the lodge, its silhouette looming through the rain, dark and jagged against the stormy sky. Even from this distance, she felt its awareness, its attention focused on them. The whispers were faint but persistent, riding the wind. "We will wait, we will remember, you cannot escape." Marcus pulled her forward, urgency in his voice. "Keep moving. Don't stop until we reach the road. We don't know what else it can do." They moved quickly, wading through mud, avoiding fallen branches and slick roots, the storm around them relentless. Each step was a struggle, yet the drive to escape, to survive, pushed them onward. The forest seemed endless, shadows twisting in the rain, trees looming like silent sentinels. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made them flinch, hearts racing. The lodge had not followed, but its presence lingered like a scar on the forest itself. Hours seemed to pass as they pressed through the storm, the rain soaking them through, chilling them to the bone. Their lanterns flickered with the wind, barely illuminating the path, casting shadows that danced like remnants of the lodge's darkness. Yet despite the exhaustion and terror, the forest offered a kind of sanctuary. They were no longer trapped within the lodge's walls, no longer at the mercy of the entity. They had survived the heart of the darkness itself. Eventually, a faint glow appeared ahead, the road slick with rain, reflecting the sparse light from distant street lamps. Claire, Marcus, and Eli staggered toward it, soaked, exhausted but alive. Behind them, the forest loomed, and beyond that, the lodge waited, silent and patient, its heart weakened but not destroyed, a reminder that some darkness never truly dies. As they finally reached the road, breathless and shivering, Claire whispered, "We made it, we survived, but it's still there, isn't it?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Yes, and one day, it will awaken again. But for now, we live." Eli looked back toward the forest, the rain dripping from his hair, his lantern swinging loosely in his hand. "We've seen it, faced it, and survived. That's all we can do. Stay vigilant. Remember what we faced, and never return." The storm continued to rage, the forest dark and unyielding, but for the first time they felt free, however temporary that freedom might be. And in the distance, the lodge's silhouette remained, a silent sentinel in the rain, waiting, patient, eternal. Even as Claire, Marcus, and Eli trudged along the rain-slicked road, their bodies soaked and shivering, the forest behind them seemed impossibly still. The storm, which had raged relentlessly over the lodge, now tapered into a constant drizzle, but the oppressive weight of the night lingered. Each of them felt it differently. Claire's mind replayed the pit and the writhing shadows in relentless detail. Marcus's heart thumped with a tension that wouldn't ease, and Eli's gaze kept darting back toward the forest, alert for movements that didn't belong. They had escaped the lodge physically, but the lodge's presence clung to them like a shadow, invisible yet palpably heavy. Claire shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around herself, suddenly aware of the unnatural quiet of the forest behind them. The whispers that had chased them in the lodge were gone, but a soft, almost imperceptible echo lingered at the edges of her mind, like a half-remembered dream she could not shake. "We remember, we will wait." It wasn't audible, but the thought pressed into her, seeding unease and fear that refused to dissipate. Marcus kept walking, but every step felt heavy, like the forest itself was resisting their escape. The rain-drenched path was uneven, roots and rocks hidden beneath the slick mud. His boots slipped more than once, and each time he caught himself, he felt the lingering presence of the lodge's influence, as though the ground itself had absorbed some essence of the entity's malice. He shook his head, trying to clear the creeping unease, but the memory of the pit, the faces, the black tendrils refused to fade. Eli was quieter than usual, scanning their surroundings with a meticulous intensity. "It's not over," he said finally, voice low and grim. "The lodge, it left something behind. That thing, whatever it was, it doesn't forget. It doesn't truly die. We've survived tonight, yes, but its influence, its shadow, may have followed us." Claire stopped abruptly, glancing around, suddenly aware of movement in the tree line. Shadows shifted unnaturally, bending and stretching against the trees, though no wind stirred them. "Did you see that?" she asked, voice tight. "Something, it moved over there." Marcus squinted into the dimness. "Probably just the forest," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. There was a tightness in his chest, a growing sense that the lodge's reach extended further than they'd realized. Every tree, every shadow seemed subtly wrong, as if warped by some lingering influence of the entity's heart. As they continued along the road, Claire began to notice details she hadn't before. A fallen branch lying perfectly upright as if propped by an unseen hand, puddles reflecting shapes that vanished when she looked directly at them, fleeting shadows that darted at the periphery of her vision. The whispers weren't there, at least not yet, but the sensation of being observed was relentless. Eli's lantern flickered violently, and for a heartbeat, the mist rising from the forest floor coalesced into shapes almost human in form. Claire screamed and stumbled back, and Marcus grabbed her shoulder. "It's trying to scare us," he said, voice trembling. "Whatever is left, it's testing us, seeing if we're afraid." Claire clenched her teeth and pressed forward, forcing herself to keep moving. "We can't stop," she said. "Not until we're far from here." Hours passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the soft patter of rain on leaves and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. The road twisted endlessly, and the forest pressed closer around them with every step. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that shapes lurked just beyond the light of the lanterns, waiting, watching, as if the shadows themselves had learned to mimic the entity's will. Then Eli froze, raising a hand. "Stop," he whispered. Claire and Marcus halted, hearts hammering. "Do you see it?" From the dense undergrowth, a shadow moved, Not like a deer, not like a human, but a twisting mass of black that seemed to absorb the rain and light, leaving only darkness behind. It was smaller than the entity in the pit but unmistakably alive, deliberate in its movement. Tendrils of shadow flickered outward, probing, testing, much like the lodge had in the chamber. Marcus swallowed hard. "It's one of its remnants," he said. "Whatever was left, it's following us." Claire's stomach churned. Then it didn't die. It left part of itself behind in the forest, in us, maybe in the lodge too. We thought we escaped, but it's still here, still aware. The shadow paused at the edge of the road, motionless, yet its presence pressed against their minds. A faint whisper echoed, carried on the wind. "You cannot leave, you belong, we remember." Eli held the lantern higher, its light trembling against the oppressive dark. "We need to keep moving," he said firmly. "No hesitation, no looking back. Whatever this is, it wants fear. We don't give it that. We don't stop until we're somewhere safe." They pressed onward, moving cautiously but quickly, through the rain-soaked forest. The shadow followed at a distance, never striking, just observing, learning, adapting. The forest that had once seemed a refuge now felt like another extension of the lodge's influence. Every tree, every shadow, a reminder that they were still being hunted. By the time the road finally led them to a faint glow of distant lights, perhaps a cabin or the edge of the nearest town, they were exhausted, soaked, minds fraying. The shadow lingered at the tree-line behind them, fading only slightly in the distance, but Claire knew it hadn't given up. The lodge had left a piece of itself, a lingering malice, and it was patient. Eli exhaled, voice low and tired. "We survived the heart, but the shadows, they'll always follow. We've won a battle, not the war." Claire shivered, the wet wind cutting through her clothes, but she knew he was right. The lodge's influence had spread beyond its walls, beyond the pit, and into the forest, and into their minds. They might have escaped physically, but the psychological echoes of that night would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And somewhere, in the darkness beyond the reach of the lantern light, the remnants of the entity waited, patient, observing, biding their time. By the time Claire, Marcus, and Eli reached the small cluster of lights marking the edge of the town, the storm had lessened to a drizzle, yet their minds remained soaked in the oppressive weight of the lodge. Their clothes clung to them, cold and heavy, but it was nothing compared to the lingering sensation of being watched, of the darkness from the lodge still pressing against the edges of their thoughts. Every shadow along the roadside seemed slightly too dark, every rustle of leaves too deliberate. The forest behind them loomed silently, like a predator waiting for its prey to falter. They paused under a flickering street lamp, catching their breaths. The warm glow of the town was a strange comfort, yet the familiarity of houses and sidewalks felt alien after the horrors they had witnessed. Marcus ran a hand over his soaked hair, shivering, and said, "We need to find somewhere safe. A place to think, to regroup." Eli nodded, glancing toward the forest one last time. "Safe is relative. Whatever followed us, whatever remains, it doesn't care about streets or lights. It just waits, it watches. We survived the lodge, but pieces of it, its will, its shadows, have followed us. They're still out there and they remember us." Claire hugged herself, teeth chattering, trying to shake the icy fear that still gripped her chest. "Then, what do we do?" she asked, voice trembling. "We can't fight shadows forever, can we?" Eli shook his head slowly. "No, but we can survive. We can stay aware, stay together. And we need to find a way to understand it, to contain what it left behind." They found a small diner still open at the edge of town. Inside, the warm air and smell of coffee and fried food was a stark contrast to the damp, suffocating smell of the lodge. They sat at a corner booth, hunched over their drinks, eyes darting to every window, every flicker of movement outside. The normalcy of the place was almost painful. It felt too safe, too ordinary compared to the terror they had just escaped. Claire shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Even here," she said, "I feel it. The shadows, like they're still clinging to me. I can't shake the feeling that they're inside my mind." Marcus reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "You're not imagining it. Residue. The lodge leaves marks. You saw it in the pit, in the shadows, in the way it twisted the walls. That doesn't end just because we left." Eli leaned back, rubbing his temples. The entity, or whatever it was, wasn't destroyed, just weakened. It left parts of itself behind. Tendrils, shadows, pieces of the lodge's consciousness. They don't need a body. They survive on memory, on fear, on attention. And we've given them both. The diner's neon sign flickered outside, and for a moment, the light cast strange shapes through the windows. Claire felt a cold brush against the back of her neck and jumped, spinning around, but no one was there. Her pulse raced as she realized it was not an external presence. It was the sensation inside her own mind, the lodge's darkness echoing through her thoughts. Marcus's voice was steady, though his jaw was tight. "We can't let it take hold. Not here, not anywhere. We focus on what's real. Right now, that's us, this diner, this moment. Shadows and whispers don't exist unless we let them." But as they spoke, subtle things began to manifest. A cup of coffee trembled slightly on the table, though no one touched it. A flicker of shadow passed over the neon sign outside, as if moving independently. Claire's vision blurred for a heartbeat, and she thought she saw the black tendrils from the pit coiling over the diner's ceiling before vanishing. Eli's hand tightened around his mug, his knuckles white. "It's testing us," he muttered. "It wants us to panic, to doubt, to remember. That's its way of regaining power." The three of them sat in tense silence, listening to the soft hum of the neon sign, the occasional clatter from the kitchen, and the quiet murmurs of the other patrons. But in the corners of their minds, the lodge whispered. Faces from the pit flickered in memory, shadows twisting along walls, tendrils brushing the edges of consciousness. They had survived the physical confrontation, but now the psychological battle began. Claire closed her eyes, trying to focus on something tangible, the warmth of her coffee, the taste of sugar, the sound of the rain outside. But every attempt to ground herself was met with flickers of darkness, phantom whispers, and the sensation of unseen eyes pressing in. "I don't think it's gone," she whispered, voice barely audible. "It's still inside me, inside us." Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. And the longer we stay in one place, the stronger it gets. It feeds on our fear, our hesitation. We need to keep moving, stay aware, and above all, stick together. That's how we survive, by not letting it take control." Eli's eyes narrowed, staring at the ceiling as if he could see beyond the room. "We've survived its heart, but the lodge's will is persistent. It left fragments of itself behind. They're quiet now but patient, and they'll grow stronger if we ignore them. We need a plan, a way to protect ourselves, or it will keep hunting us in ways we can't predict." The rain outside continued, relentless, masking the lodge's lingering whispers but also serving as a constant reminder of the storm they had endured. Outside the windows, the forest lay silent but watchful, trees swaying as if alive, their branches scratching against one another like fingers. Even as the town offered the illusion of safety, the survivors knew the lodge's influence had followed them, its shadow stretching further than they could see, seeding fear and uncertainty that might never fully leave them. And somewhere in the distance beyond the town lights, the forest waited, patient, eternal, and full of unseen eyes. The lodge's shadow had left its mark, and no matter how far they fled, it would always be there, whispering, watching, and waiting. Even within the safety of the town, Claire, Marcus, and Eli could not escape the lodge's lingering presence. That night, in a small rental cabin on the outskirts, the rain tapping softly against the roof, they tried to rest. But sleep offered no comfort, only the haunting echo of what they had faced. Each shadow in the room seemed to twitch unnaturally when they closed their eyes, stretching and bending in ways that defied reality. The lodge's influence had followed them, subtle but insistent, a quiet pressure on their minds, probing, testing. Claire woke first. Her chest ached as if something heavy pressed against it. The room was dark, though the storm outside had dimmed to a drizzle. She blinked, trying to adjust, but the corners of the room seemed unnaturally black, coiling like smoke. The whisper came first, a faint hiss, barely audible over the rain. "Closer, closer." She froze, heart hammering, sure she was imagining it, but the air around her felt charged, heavy, as if the lodge's shadow were in the room with her. Marcus stirred beside her, murmuring something incoherent, his brow furrowed. Claire leaned closer, noticing his hands twitching as if trying to ward something off. His breathing was shallow, uneven, almost panicked. The whispers grew slightly louder, threading into the rhythm of their thoughts, shaping themselves into half-formed sentences. "You cannot escape. You belong. We remember." She shook him lightly. "Marcus, wake up," she whispered. He opened his eyes slowly, the fear in them reflecting her own. The corners of the room seemed to stretch, shadows moving along the walls, lengthening unnaturally toward them. Claire's own reflection in the window seemed to shift independently, eyes wider than her own, lips twisted in a silent scream. Eli stirred in the next bed, murmuring, "It's in the walls, it's still in the walls." His voice cracked, and he clutched the blankets, eyes darting at nothing. The whispers intensified, threading their way into each of their thoughts. "Stay, stay, stay." The lodge was no longer a distant place. Its fragments had followed them, and it was beginning to assert control subtly, using fear to weaken their minds. Claire pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block the sound, but the whispers were inside her now, inside her mind, molding her perception. Shapes formed in the dark corners of the cabin, indistinct but menacing, stretching, curling, twisting. Tendrils of shadow flickered along the floorboards and walls, not solid but perceptible, like smoke moving with purpose. She realized with horror that sleep was no refuge. The lodge could reach her even here, even miles away. Marcus gritted his teeth. We have to fight it, he said shakily. Even here, we can't let it control us. But the words felt weak, as though the shadows themselves were sapping his will. Claire saw him glance at the window, and the reflection of the outside forest was distorted. Trees bent unnaturally toward them, branches stretching like grasping fingers. The lodge's reach had extended, using the shadows and the lingering fragments of its heart to manipulate the forest and the space around them. Eli sat up fully, rubbing his face. "It's testing us," he said, voice low but urgent. "It wants fear. It wants to see us falter. The lodge is patient. It doesn't strike outright. It undermines, it infiltrates, it waits for us to break." His eyes flicked to the dark corners of the cabin. The shadows there seemed to pulse in response, reacting to his words. Break, falter, belong. The whispers echoed in their minds like a chorus, insidious and relentless. Claire's hands shook as she tried to steady her breathing. "We survived the pit," she whispered. We can survive this. It's fragments now. It's weaker. We can resist it." Marcus nodded, gripping her hand tightly. "We have to, no matter what it tries. We remember what it is. We remember how we fought it. That gives us strength. We can't let it feed on our fear." For a long moment, the cabin was silent except for the rain and their uneven breathing. Then shadows shifted again, subtly at first, crawling along the walls toward them, responding to their vigilance. The whispers retreated slightly, as if sensing that they were resisting, but the pressure remained. Claire realized that their minds were now the battlefield. The lodge no longer needed tendrils or pit horrors. It could manipulate perception, warp reality, and invade dreams. They huddled together, whispering reassurances, holding lanterns in case of waking darkness, keeping vigil through the long night. The storm outside continued, its patter a small comfort against the psychological storm inside the cabin. Shadows danced along the walls, and whispers lingered at the edge of hearing, but they forced themselves to focus on the tangible. The warmth of the blankets, the solidity of the floor beneath them, the presence of each other. By dawn, the storm had passed completely. The whispers faded, though a lingering chill remained in the air, and shadows still clung to the corners, unwilling to vanish entirely. They had survived the night, but each knew in the depths of their minds that the lodge's influence had planted seeds that might grow at any moment. The nightmares had begun, and the real fight, against the shadows within themselves, was only just starting. Claire looked at Marcus and Eli, exhaustion and fear etched into their faces. "We survived physically," she said softly, "but mentally, it's not over. Not even close." Eli nodded, voice grim. "The lodge doesn't just exist in its walls. Its fragments follow, they linger, and they wait. We're carrying pieces of it inside our minds now. Every shadow, every fear, every memory can become its playground. We have to be ready, and we have to stick together." The three of them rose, preparing for the day, for the battle that would stretch far beyond the lodge itself. Outside, the forest stood silent, unyielding, and patient, a reminder that the darkness they had faced was not confined to a single place. The lodge's reach extended into the night, into their minds, into the world around them, and the fight to survive it was only beginning. The next morning, the air in the cabin was heavy, humid from the remnants of the storm, and the sunlight that managed to pierce the clouds did little to ease the tension that clung to Claire, Marcus, and Eli. The psychological residue of the lodge had not faded overnight. If anything, it had grown more insidious. Each creak of the floorboards, each shadow that lingered just beyond the lantern light, seemed deliberate, as though the lodge's fragments were testing their vigilance. Even mundane sounds, rain dripping from eaves, the rustle of distant leaves, the faint hum of passing traffic, felt distorted, warped by the presence they carried within them. Claire tried to focus on simple tasks, unpacking their few belongings, boiling water for coffee, arranging the cabin in a semblance of order. But every time she looked up, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, twitch, or coil in ways that defied physics. Sometimes, when she glanced at the window, she thought she saw movement in the forest beyond, a darker patch against the already dense foliage, shapes moving just at the edge of sight. Marcus and Eli were similarly restless, fidgeting, pacing, and whispering among themselves, as if trying to keep the lodge's influence at bay through constant motion. Eli was the first to break the oppressive silence. "It's subtle now," he said, voice low, almost cautious. "It doesn't need to strike directly anymore. It just creeps, insinuates itself, warps perception. Look at the shadows in this room. They're not normal. They move differently. Not from the sun, not from our lights. And it's not just here. It's in the forest. It's in the roads we walk. Even now, it's testing our boundaries." Marcus rubbed his eyes, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I can feel it," he admitted. "When I blink, it's like I see things out of the corner of my eye. Flickers, shapes, shadows that shouldn't be there. I try to focus, but the lodge's fragments, they're in my mind, in my head. I can't shake them." Claire swallowed hard, nodding. "It's in all of us. I woke up half the night thinking I saw tendrils crawling along the ceiling, felt them brushing against me. I knew it wasn't real, but it felt real enough to make my hands shake. The lodge, it's like it planted itself inside us, in our thoughts, and now it's growing." Eli's gaze sharpened. "We need to do something about it. Awareness alone isn't enough. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It strengthens when we falter, when we fear. Every small thought of doubt, every moment of hesitation, it feeds on that. We survived the lodge, yes, but surviving the entity wasn't the end. Now it's our own minds that are the battlefield." Claire shivered, feeling a phantom chill brush her shoulder. She spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. Yet the sensation lingered, the unmistakable touch of something that didn't belong, a presence watching, waiting, subtle but undeniable. It whispered in her thoughts again, soft, taunting, "You cannot escape, you belong." Marcus exhaled sharply. "It's following us," he said, voice tight. "Not like before. It's not physical, but it's here. In our heads, in our thoughts. And the longer we stay in one place, the stronger it will get. The lodge doesn't need walls anymore. It has us." Eli stood, moving to the window. The forest outside was wet and silent, the drizzle from the previous storm leaving a slick shine across leaves and branches. Even in daylight, the shadows between the trees seemed wrong, almost sentient, bending and twisting subtly. "We need to leave the forest behind," he said. "Distance may not destroy the fragments, but it might weaken them. We have to be vigilant. We can't stop. And we need to make sure we're never alone. The lodge's fragments feed on isolation as much as fear." Claire nodded, her hands trembling. "But even here in the daylight, I can feel it watching. Every time I close my eyes, every time I blink, it's there. It's whispering. It's learning. It's patient." Hours passed in tense silence. Every noise outside, every shifting shadow indoors, seemed amplified. Claire tried to focus on the warmth of the coffee in her hands, the solidity of the floorboards beneath her feet, but the fragments of the lodge were patient, insidious, weaving themselves into her perception. She caught Marcus staring at an empty corner, eyes wide and unblinking, and realized he wasn't seeing anything obvious. He was feeling it, sensing the presence that lingered even when unseen. Eli spoke again, voice steady but urgent. "We survived the lodge, but its fragments have followed us. They are patient, invisible, insidious. We must resist, constantly, consciously. Every shadow, every flicker of doubt, every moment of fear is a doorway. If we falter, it can return fully. And when it does, it won't be like the pit or the tendrils. It will be inside us, and we may not even realize it until it's too late." As the day wore on, the subtle manipulations grew more pronounced. Objects seemed to shift slightly when they weren't looking, reflections in mirrors appeared to move independently, and faint whispers drifted at the edges of their hearing. Claire caught herself glancing nervously at the window repeatedly, convinced she saw tendrils of shadow reaching from the forest toward the cabin, only to blink and see nothing. The lodge's influence was real, persistent, and unrelenting, and it had followed them beyond its walls into the forest and now into their lives. That evening, as the sun dipped behind storm-darkened clouds, the shadows lengthened again. Claire, Marcus, and Eli sat together in the cabin, lanterns casting warm but flickering light, eyes darting constantly, hands tense, muscles coiled like springs. Every movement, every sound, every whisper of the wind could be a fragment of the lodge, probing, testing, learning. They had survived the physical horrors, but the psychological war had only just begun, and the lodge's patient, malevolent influence was waiting, always waiting for the moment to strike. Night fell quickly, bringing a darkness that seemed heavier than the storm clouds that had passed earlier. The cabin, once a sanctuary of wood and warm light, now felt suffocating, the shadows crawling across walls and floorboards like ink spreading in water. Claire, Marcus, and Eli sat huddled together, trying to ignore the persistent whispers that had followed them from the lodge, but tonight they felt different. Stronger. More deliberate. The fragments of the lodge were no longer content to linger at the edges of perception. They were probing, testing the limits of fear and sanity. Claire closed her eyes, attempting to focus on the warmth of the lanterns, the steady breathing of her friends, anything tangible. But even with her eyes shut, she could see movement. Shadows stretched across the ceiling, tendrils coiling and twisting like smoke. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. A whisper slithered through her mind, "Closer, we are always close, you cannot hide." Marcus shifted beside her, his hand trembling as he reached for his coffee mug. "It's inside us," he said quietly, voice taut with tension. "I can feel it. When I blink, when I think, it's there, following me, twisting what I see. I keep seeing faces from the pit, watching me." Eli's gaze was fixed on the shadows in the corners, lantern held high. "It's not just faces," he said, voice low. "It's memories, fears, all the things we've tried to bury. It's pulling them out, weaving them into what we see, what we feel. And it feeds on them. That's how it grows stronger now." Claire opened her eyes and froze. The far corner of the cabin, empty only moments before, now seemed filled with a darker, moving shadow. It stretched and writhed like a living curtain of smoke, and within it, fleeting glimpses of human forms appeared, distorted, faceless, reaching toward them. She blinked, and the forms vanished, leaving only the oppressive darkness and a faint, metallic scent in the air. Her stomach nodded. It's real," she whispered, voice shaking. "Even here, even miles from the lodge, it's following us. And it's learning how to get inside our minds." Marcus nodded grimly. "I've been seeing it too. Sometimes in reflections, sometimes just in the corners of my eyes. It moves when I'm not looking directly at it, twisting reality. I try to focus on the real, on what's tangible, but it warps everything." Eli exhaled slowly, voice measured but tense. "Tonight is its first real assault. It can't reach its full strength yet, not without the lodge itself, but it can push, manipulate, probe. We need to stay awake, stay alert, and stay together. If we sleep alone, it will strike fully in our dreams. That's when the fragments are strongest." The first hour passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional crack of a floorboard or distant gust of wind. Then subtle changes began. Claire noticed that the walls seemed to pulse slightly, breathing in rhythm with the whispers in her mind. Marcus's shadow, cast by the lantern, stretched unnaturally, writhing like a living entity independent of him. And in the window, the forest outside seemed to shift and writhe, branches twisting in impossible patterns, creating shapes that almost looked like the faces of the fallen, distorted and silent, staring back at them. Claire rubbed her temples. "It's showing us things, memories, fears, people we've lost, places we've escaped. It's manipulating reality to weaken us." Marcus clenched his fists. "I saw my own face in the mirror, older, twisted, eyes black like the pit. It tried to speak to me. I can still hear its voice in my head." Eli moved to the center of the room, lantern high, pacing slowly. "It wants fear. It wants despair. Every second we panic, every moment we doubt ourselves, it grows stronger. Remember the pit. Remember the shadows. Remember that we fought them and survived. That is the only way to resist." Claire swallowed hard. "But even surviving doesn't stop it from twisting us. I feel it, right here," she said, pressing a hand to her temple. "It's like it's inside me now, learning me, understanding me, testing me. I can't stop thinking about it." Marcus nodded, voice hoarse. "I know. It's in me too. And Eli, you feel it, right? The way the shadows respond when we focus too hard on one thing, the way our own thoughts seem to echo back, twisted." Eli didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, and it's just the beginning. Once it understands us better, it will manipulate dreams, fears, memories. We will see it in every reflection, hear it in every sound. It will make us question what is real and what isn't. And if we falter, even for a second, it can take hold fully." A sudden flicker of movement caught Claire's eye. She turned, and for an instant, the doorway seemed filled with a shadowy mass, tendrils stretching toward them, forming vague, humanoid shapes before vanishing the moment she blinked. Her heartbeat raced. It's trying to reach us," she whispered. "Even here. Even miles away." Marcus grabbed her hand tightly. "We resist. Together. Don't let it get inside your thoughts. Don't let it take root. Focus on reality, what is real. The cabin, the lantern, us, together. Nothing else is real unless we let it be. Eli stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room, hands steady despite the tension. It's not defeated. Not yet. But it hasn't won either. Stay awake. Stay together. And don't forget, the lodge may be gone, but its fragments are patient. They will test us, probe us, and try to break us. And tonight is the first test. The three of them huddled in the center of the room, lanterns flickering, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Outside, the forest waited silently, shadows coiling and twisting beyond the reach of light. Within the cabin, the lodge's fragments moved subtly, unseen but felt, probing, testing, waiting for any sign of weakness. The night stretched endlessly, a slow, relentless assault on their senses, a psychological war they had no choice but to fight. And as the first true night of waking nightmares unfolded, Claire realized the fight for survival had only just begun. Not in the forest, not in the lodge, but within their own minds, where the shadows now lingered permanently, patient, waiting. The night had deepened into a relentless darkness that pressed against the cabin's thin walls, seeping in with a weight that seemed almost physical. Claire, Marcus, and Eli huddled near the center of the room, lanterns casting trembling light over the wooden floors, but the lodge's fragments had begun to escalate their assault. It was no longer subtle whispers or peripheral shadows. Now the fragments manipulated perception itself, warping the world around them, turning the familiar into something alien, threatening, and terrifying. Claire blinked and swore she saw the walls bending inward, breathing slowly as though the cabin itself were alive. Every corner seemed to throb in rhythm with the lodge's whispers, twisting shadows that shifted independently of any light. She rubbed her eyes, hoping to reset her perception, but the images persisted. Elongated faces peering from darkened corners, eyes too wide, mouths moving in silent, mocking laughter. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the whispers found their way inside anyway. You cannot hide, you belong, we remember. Marcus shook violently. It's everywhere, he whispered, voice tight. Even when I close my eyes, it doesn't stop. Faces, tendrils, shapes, and reflections. I can't tell what's real anymore. My own reflection. I saw it blink differently from me. It smiled while I didn't. It tried to speak. His breathing came in sharp, shallow bursts, and Claire could see the tension etched into every muscle of his body. Eli moved cautiously to the window, lantern held high, scanning the forest beyond. The trees seemed to twist unnaturally in the darkness, their branches bending toward the cabin as if reaching, grasping. Shadows flickered across the glass, forming vague human shapes that darted just beyond direct observation. It's learning us faster than we can anticipate, he said quietly, voice strained. It understands our fears now. Every shadow, every subtle movement, it's exploiting our perception. And it's patient. It's been patient for centuries. It doesn't need to act quickly. It just waits for the right moment to drive us insane. Claire's stomach churned as the room seemed to pulse in tandem with her heartbeat. A chair in the corner slowly rotated, though no one touched it. A picture on the wall warped, the smiling faces in the photograph stretching grotesquely, eyes twisting to follow her every movement. It's playing with us, she whispered. I can feel it inside my head, shaping what I see, turning everything normal into. She stopped, unable to find words adequate to describe the twisting terror in her perception. Marcus pointed at the window. Look, the forest, it's alive. The trees seemed to sway with intent, black tendrils of shadow flickering across their trunks and intertwining with the branches. In the dim light, Claire could make out fleeting glimpses of shapes, humanoid but twisted, faces without features, reaching toward them from between the trunks. The lodge's fragments had extended their reach far beyond the cabin walls, coiling through the forest, insinuating themselves into reality. Eli's hand shook slightly as he gestured for them to follow him to the middle of the room. Stay together. Keep your focus. These hallucinations, they aren't real in the physical sense, but they are real to the mind. The lodge fragments feed on our perception, warp it, and then feed on the fear it produces. Panic, doubt, despair, that's how it strengthens itself. The shadows reacted almost immediately, stretching toward them, twisting, coiling, forming near-human figures that walked along the walls, disappearing and reappearing with impossible fluidity. Claire swore she saw one step out from the wall entirely, standing a few feet away, faceless, its head tilted unnaturally. It didn't move, yet she felt it watching, judging, learning. Her stomach dropped. Closer, we are always near, you belong. Marcus's grip on her hand was tight, knuckles white. It's trying to break us, he said. Not just physically, not just psychologically. It wants to make us doubt everything we see, everything we know. It wants to control us from the inside out. Claire's vision flickered, and the cabin seemed to dissolve around her, replaced by the pit from the lodge, dark, damp, writhing shadows reaching up from the depths. She gasped, falling to her knees, convinced she was back inside the lodge. Eli grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the real room. She closed her eyes, taking shaky, measured breaths, but the fragments had left an imprint on her perception. The lodge was no longer just a place, it was a state of being, a psychological weight that could invade anywhere. The lanterns flickered violently, and shadows stretched long across the floor, forming letters that weren't there a moment before. We remember. We wait. You belong. Claire's throat went dry. She realized that the fragments didn't need to be physically present. They were everywhere now, embedded in perception, in reflections, in the way the mind interpreted light and shadow. Marcus whispered urgently, "We can't sleep. Not tonight. Not like this. If we let our guard down, if we close our eyes, it will enter fully. We have to stay awake, resist together." Hours passed in tense, agonizing silence. Every blink, every twitch of shadow, every whisper in the corners of their minds was an assault on their sanity. Claire felt her mind fraying, fragments of the lodge entwined with her own thoughts, echoing memories and fears, warping them, twisting them until she wasn't always sure which were hers and which were the lodge's. Marcus's breaths came shallow and quick, and Eli's eyes never strayed from the shadows, scanning, anticipating, always alert. By the time the first faint light of dawn filtered through the windows, the hallucinations had faded slightly, retreating into the edges of perception, but the psychological impact remained. Their minds were exhausted, raw from the assault. The fragments of the lodge had begun to establish a permanent foothold in their consciousness, a patient and insidious presence that would not be shaken by distance or daylight. Claire leaned back against the wall, shivering. It's inside us," she whispered. "Not just here, not just in the cabin. It's in us, and it's patient. It's waiting." Eli nodded slowly, voice grim. "Yes, and we have to be even more vigilant. Every moment of doubt, every misstep, is an opportunity for it to strengthen. Tonight was just the beginning. The fragments are learning. They are growing. And they will test us again, harder next time." Marcus's gaze was fixed on the shadows still lingering in the corners, flickering in response to the first sunlight. "Then we fight," he said softly. "We stay together. We stay aware. And we resist. We have to, or it wins." Outside, the forest waited silently, dark and patient. The fragments of the lodge had followed them, insinuating themselves into perception, into thought, into waking reality. And now, no matter how far they fled, the psychological war had begun in earnest, a battle that would test every ounce of their sanity, their courage, and their will to survive. By mid-morning, the cabin felt almost alien, as though the lodge's fragments had marked it as their own. Even in daylight, the shadows were thick, persistent, moving in ways that defied natural light. Claire, Marcus, and Eli had stayed awake almost continuously, exhaustion clawing at their muscles and minds, but sleep was impossible. Any moment of vulnerability felt like an invitation to the lodge fragments, and the psychological pressure was relentless. The fragments had begun to blur the line between perception and reality, leaving them unsure of what they could trust. Eli finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. "We can't stay here forever. We've survived the lodge physically, but the fragments are growing. They'll never leave us alone if we remain in one place waiting. We need answers. We need knowledge of what we're dealing with, and we can't do it alone." Claire shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Knowledge? About what? We barely survived the lodge. We saw what it could do, what it is. Who's going to help us with whatever this is?" Eli's eyes were hard, focused. "There are people who study things like this, entities, manifestations, places where darkness lingers beyond the physical. We need someone who understands. Someone who can tell us how to protect ourselves, how to contain these fragments, or at least slow them down. If we wait, we'll be consumed." Marcus ran a hand through his wet hair, the tension in his face palpable. "I don't even know if we can trust anyone. How do we know the fragments won't follow us there? How do we know someone won't make it worse?" Eli shook his head slowly. "We don't have the luxury of doubt. The fragments are already here. They've infiltrated our perception, and if we do nothing, they'll continue to grow stronger, to warp our reality, to break us from the inside. Even if the risk is high, doing nothing is far worse." They packed what little they had, their movements slow, careful, because even the simple act of bending over, lifting, and carrying felt distorted by the lodge's influence. Shadows seemed to crawl along the floorboards, stretching toward them as if aware of their intentions. The forest outside, which had once offered a strange comfort, now felt oppressive, each tree a silent observer, branches swaying with unnatural intent. As they set out along the road, the fragments of the lodge seemed to react. The forest lining the roadside darkened unnaturally, even in daylight, and the edges of Claire's vision flickered with movement. She blinked rapidly, trying to ground herself in reality, but every time she looked directly at the shadows, they shifted, coiling like smoke, testing her perception. She felt the whisper again, faint but insistent, "Closer, always closer, you belong." Hours passed, and the journey to the town's outskirts seemed endless. Every roadside building, every passing car, every sound carried the subtle weight of the lodge fragments, bending their perception, forcing them to second-guess what was real. Marcus caught himself seeing people walking along the sidewalks that weren't there when he looked again. Eli's eyes kept flicking toward the trees, expecting tendrils or faceless figures to emerge. And Claire, she kept glancing at her own reflection in shop windows, convinced she saw distortions. A twisted smile, shadowed eyes, a face that was almost hers but not quite. Finally, they arrived at a small, secluded bookstore tucked between two abandoned shops. The sign read simply, "Occult and Folklore, Knowledge of the Unseen." The windows were dark, dust-coated, but something about the place felt real, solid, almost safe compared to the distortions that had stalked them all day. Inside, the air smelled of aged paper and old wood. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, stacked with thick, leather-bound tomes, arcane diagrams, and obscure manuscripts. A single elderly man sat behind a desk, head bent over a book, but he looked up as they entered, eyes sharp, intelligent, and oddly unstartled by their presence. "I know why you're here," he said quietly, voice low but commanding. "You carry remnants of something older than you, older than this forest. I've seen this before. Fragments of darkness, born from places where fear becomes manifest, where consciousness itself can be corrupted by malevolent will. You've survived the lodge, but pieces of it have followed you, and now it grows inside your minds." Claire's breath caught. You know about the fragments?" she asked, voice trembling. "How do we stop them? How do we fight them?" The man leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. "Stop? Complete destruction is impossible once a place like the lodge has spread its influence beyond its walls. But you can resist, contain, and protect yourselves. Knowledge, ritual, vigilance, these are your tools. And the first step is understanding what you carry. You must learn to differentiate between the fragments and reality itself, to prevent them from gaining strength from your fear, your doubt, your hesitation." Marcus swallowed hard. "We've been seeing things, shadows, faces, distortions, hallucinations that feel real. How do we know what's real?" The man's eyes were steady. "Reality is what persists when you observe it carefully, repeatedly, and without emotional distortion. Fear and doubt distort perception. The fragments thrive on that. Every hallucination, every whisper, every subtle manipulation you feel, acknowledge it but do not succumb. Train yourselves to recognize the difference between the lodge's influence and the true, tangible world. Only then can you maintain control." Eli stepped forward, urgency in his eyes. "And if we fail? If the fragments take hold fully?" The man's expression darkened. "Then you risk becoming conduits for the lodge's influence, vessels for its fragments. Your minds, once corrupted, will spread its will further, allowing it to reach others, other places, until it is no longer contained. That is why vigilance is absolute, and knowledge is paramount." Claire swallowed, feeling the weight of their situation. The fragments were patient, relentless, insidious. And yet, here was someone who understood them, who had seen this before. Perhaps, she thought, this was their only hope, not of defeating the lodge entirely, but of surviving its persistent, creeping influence. The man gestured to the shelves. "Start here. These texts contain methods to protect your minds, to fortify perception, and to create boundaries against the fragments. You will need to learn quickly. Every day, every hour counts. And remember, never alone. Always together." The fragments exploit isolation as much as fear. As they began poring over the dusty tomes, the weight of the lodge fragments pressing on their minds persisted. But for the first time since the pit, there was a thread of hope, a tool, a strategy, a guide. Knowledge, they realized, might not destroy the lodge, but it could keep the fragments at bay, if they were careful, vigilant, and unwavering in their focus. Outside, the forest remained silent, patient, and waiting. But inside the dimly lit bookstore, A small, fragile sense of control returned. They had taken the first step in fighting back, and the psychological war, though far from over, now had direction. The bookstore's air was thick with the scent of old paper and incense, a strange but grounding presence in contrast to the lodge's insidious whispers that still clawed at their minds. Claire, Marcus, and Eli pored over the tomes, tracing diagrams, reading incantations, and memorizing rituals meant to shield the mind from persistent, malevolent influence. For the first time since leaving the lodge, there was a tangible plan, a methodical approach to resisting the fragments that had infiltrated their perceptions. Yet as they read, each word, each symbol, each instruction carried an unspoken warning. The fragments would fight back. Eli adjusted a small circle of salt and chalk on the wooden floor, a simple protective barrier outlined in accordance with the instructions from one of the texts. "It's not foolproof," he muttered, "but it slows them, keeps them at the edges of our perception. It gives our minds a foundation to resist from." He gestured for Claire and Marcus to step inside the circle. The three of them formed a triangle, hands clasped, lanterns casting flickering light across the intricate symbols beneath their feet. At first, the fragment's influence seemed to waver. The oppressive pressure at the edges of their minds loosened slightly, and the shadows in the room hesitated, no longer moving with complete freedom. Claire felt a moment of relief, almost giddy at the thought that perhaps they could reclaim their minds from the lodge's reach. It's working," she whispered, voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, his grip on her hand tight but steady. "For now. But I can feel them testing the boundary, waiting for us to falter." It was Eli who first noticed the subtle change. The shadows along the walls were twitching unnaturally, converging, forming shapes that were impossible to ignore. The fragments weren't gone, they were adapting. They no longer tried to attack directly. Instead, they began probing, sending tendrils of perception toward the edges of the protective circle, flickers of movement and half-formed images designed to sow doubt. Faces appeared briefly in the corners of their vision, distorted and silent, vanishing the instant anyone tried to focus on them. Whispers slithered into their thoughts. "You cannot resist, you belong, we are patient." Claire's stomach knotted. "They're testing us. They're learning faster than we anticipated. It's like they're probing the circle itself, looking for weaknesses." Marcus swallowed hard, eyes wide. "And if they find one?" Eli's jaw tightened. "Then the fragments can break through. Even a second of hesitation, even a tiny doubt, and they can start warping perception again. That's why we have to focus. Absolute attention. Absolute belief in the circle. If we falter, it's over." The first retaliation came subtly, almost innocuously. The air seemed to grow colder, a chill brushing along their necks and wrists, whispering in their minds with a sharper, more urgent tone. A chair slid slightly across the floor, although no one touched it. The shadows pulsed and rippled as though alive, bending toward them, reacting to the faintest flicker of fear. Claire saw her own reflection in the window twist, smile, and whisper silently, the words perfectly aligned with the lodge's cruel cadence. Marcus gritted his teeth. It's inside the room now, fully aware of what we're doing. It's adapting to the protections, trying to undermine them. Stay focused. Don't react. Don't give it fear. The protective circle trembled slightly under the pressure, faint lines of chalk glowing momentarily as though responding to the fragment's probing. Claire forced herself to breathe evenly, grounding her mind on the physical world. The lantern's steady light, the solid wooden floor beneath her feet, the warmth of Marcus's hand in hers. She repeated a mantra from the tome under her breath, a string of words meant to reinforce perception against manipulation. The pressure eased slightly but never disappeared completely. Hours passed with the fragments probing in waves. Every blink, every twitch, every involuntary thought became a potential weapon in the fragment's hands. At one point, Claire nearly panicked when she thought she saw Eli's reflection in a darkened corner, its face twisted, eyes black as the pit, smiling mockingly. She wanted to run, to break the circle, but Marcus's steady hand on her arm reminded her to hold fast. "We survive by resisting," he murmured, "by holding together. Don't give it anything." Eli's voice was calm but strained. "The fragments are clever. They don't just attack, they manipulate. They warp what we see, hear, feel, and remember. They'll show us what we fear most, what we can't handle. And if we lose focus even briefly, the circle won't hold." Claire felt a wave of nausea, her mind flickering with images of the lodge's pit, the shadows, the tendrils. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself back to the room, back to the circle, back to the reality they could touch and feel. Sweat ran down her temples, but she held her position, repeating the protective words aloud, letting the rhythm anchor her thoughts. As midnight approached, the fragments began to retreat, but not entirely. They lingered at the edges of perception, patient, coiling, waiting. The protective measures had slowed them, forced them to adapt, but the fragments had learned something important. That these three were resilient, that fear alone could no longer break them, and that subtlety and patience were their new weapons. Eli exhaled slowly. For now we've held them off. But this is just the beginning. The fragments are evolving. They are patient, intelligent, and relentless. Every night, every hour we must repeat these measures. We cannot falter. We cannot doubt. The lodge may be gone, but its influence, its fragments, will not rest. And neither can we. Claire leaned against Marcus, exhausted but resolute. Then we fight, she whispered. We fight together. Every moment, every thought, every shadow, we fight. Outside, the forest waited silently, patient and dark. The lodge's fragments had retreated for now, but they were learning, watching, and waiting for any sign of weakness. And inside the protective circle, the three survivors understood that this battle, between mind and shadow, reality and hallucination, fear and willpower, was far from over. The days that followed were a relentless cycle of vigilance, study, and subtle terror. Claire, Marcus, and Eli maintained the protective circle as best they could, repeating the rituals, reciting incantations, and tracing the symbols with painstaking care. Yet the fragments of the lodge had grown cleverer. They no longer attacked outright. Their strategy was patient, insidious, and deeply psychological. Every perception, every memory, every flicker of thought was now a battlefield. Claire noticed it first in her dreams, though she never truly slept. Even brief moments of unconsciousness became arenas for the fragments' manipulations. She would wake with her mind racing, images of twisted forests, of tendrils crawling along the ceiling, of faces emerging from the shadows of her own reflection. Each image carried an emotional weight designed to destabilize her, to plant doubt and fear. The fragments were learning the patterns of her mind, probing her vulnerabilities, and finding ways to exploit them without ever needing physical presence. Marcus's hallucinations were sharper, more aggressive. Shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and warp in impossible ways. One evening, he thought he saw a tendril reach for the lantern itself, though when he looked directly, nothing was there. Mirrors reflected not just the room, but warped visions of the three of them. Claire's eyes black and unblinking, Eli's face twisted in silent screams, his own reflection splitting into multiple selves, each one moving independently, each one staring back with accusing eyes. He clenched his fists and forced himself to blink, forcing reality back into focus, but each effort left him more exhausted, fraying the edges of his sanity. Eli, always the most composed, began to show cracks as well. The fragments were subtle with him, using his own analytical mind against him. Symbols on the walls would seem slightly different from one moment to the next. Protective circles appeared skewed, incantations he had memorized would sound off in his mind, syllables twisting into whispered taunts. He knew the fragments were patient, but even patience had limits when it came to mental strain. The psychological assault was escalating, a war of attrition designed to weaken them slowly but inevitably. One evening, as the wind howled outside and rain streaked the windows, the fragments made their boldest move yet. The protective circle flickered, faint cracks forming along the chalked lines, as though the fragments were testing its strength. Shadows condensed into near-human shapes, faces just visible in the corner of their eyes, mouths moving without sound, eyes fixed on them with impossible intent. A whisper slithered inside Claire's mind, colder and more deliberate than ever. "We are patient. We are inevitable. You cannot hold us forever." Claire gasped and grabbed Marcus's arm. "They're stronger. They're breaking through." Marcus shook his head, voice tense. "No, we're holding them. Just don't look at them directly. Focus on the circle. Focus on reality. Don't give them power." Eli moved to the center, scanning the shadows. "They're learning. They know we're aware of them now. They're adapting their attacks, pushing at our minds indirectly, seeking hesitation, feeding on fatigue. Every second we falter, every thought of doubt, they gain strength. We must stay vigilant. Every moment counts." The night stretched on, long and unrelenting. Every flicker of movement, every whisper, every reflection of their own faces in the darkened windows became a weapon. Claire saw fleeting visions of the lodge itself, pit tendrils, shadowed figures lurking in corners, echoes of screams that weren't hers but felt impossibly close. Marcus felt his own fears being whispered back at him in distorted tones. The lodge's fragments had learned his voice, his thoughts, and they twisted them, turning his own memories against him. Eli's analytical mind calculated, recalculated, and struggled to maintain composure, but even he could feel the pressure building, the subtle erosion of certainty that the fragments thrived upon. By the early hours of the morning, exhaustion had begun to take its toll. The circle still held, but barely. Claire's hands trembled as she traced the lines of chalk, Marcus's voice wavered as he repeated the incantations, and Eli's eyes darted constantly, scanning for subtle distortions that might indicate a breach. Outside, the forest remained silent but sentient, shadows twisting and bending with impossible precision, observing, waiting for even the smallest lapse. And then, in a sudden moment that felt like a culmination of every small, insidious push, the fragments struck psychologically in unison. Each of them experienced a vision so visceral it was almost tangible. The cabin dissolved, replaced by the lodge itself. The pit yawned below them, tendrils crawling along the walls, along the ceiling, wrapping around their limbs without touching them physically. Voices of unseen entities whispered directly into their consciousness, each one personalized to exploit their deepest fears. Claire saw the faces of people she had tried to forget, distorted and accusing. Marcus saw his own reflection splitting endlessly, eyes black and unblinking, mocking him. Eli saw his symbols shift, rearranging themselves into impossible, threatening patterns, each line a direct assault on his perception. But they held fast. They clung to one another, anchored to the physical reality of the protective circle. Their minds screamed in defiance, forcing perception back into reality, suppressing the hallucinations long enough for the fragments to retreat, if only temporarily. Sweat soaked their clothes, hands trembled, and hearts pounded, but the circle remained intact. Eli exhaled slowly, voice strained but steady. They've escalated. They're testing limits. They want to see how far they can push us, how quickly they can erode our minds. But we survived. We resisted. And that is the key. Every test they throw at us, every hallucination, every shadow, every whisper, resist. That is how we survive. Claire leaned against Marcus, shivering but resolute. We have no choice. If we falter even once, they win. Marcus nodded, eyes scanning the remaining shadows. Then we don't falter. Not now. Not ever. Together. Always together. Outside, the forest waited silently, patient and dark. The fragments had learned, adapted, and were far from defeated. Inside the protective circle, 3 survivors understood the stakes more clearly than ever. The psychological war was far from over, and each night would bring new horrors designed to push them to the brink of sanity. But for now they had resisted. And that resistance, fleeting, fragile, yet absolute, was the only thing standing between them and the lodge's relentless, patient fragments. The days that followed were an exhausting haze of study, vigilance, and carefully measured action. Claire, Marcus, and Eli had learned to maintain the protective circle, but it had become painfully clear that the fragments of the lodge were far more adaptive than they had anticipated. Each night brought a more intricate, insidious psychological assault. Every sound, shadow, reflection, and even fleeting thought was a potential weapon for the fragments to manipulate, distort, and exploit. Sleep had become a concept too dangerous to indulge in. The fragments were patient, but the survivors were learning to be patient too, though every second of resistance was measured against growing fatigue and the constant whispering in the corners of their minds. Eli proposed a new strategy. The circle is our foundation, he said, tracing fresh chalk lines around the perimeter of the bookstore floor, each mark precise and deliberate. But the fragments are learning. They can manipulate perception within the circle, subtle distortions that test focus and willpower. We need to expand, reinforce, and innovate. The protective measures must become second nature, ritualized beyond thought. Every line, every word, every symbol must be internalized. Only then can we push them back further. Claire and Marcus nodded, hands shaking as they helped him trace additional symbols, their movements precise, almost mechanical. Outside, rain streaked the windows, tapping in irregular rhythms, as though the forest itself were attempting to communicate, or perhaps to mock their efforts. Each droplet seemed to carry a whisper, faint but insistent, "We see you, always, closer." 4 hours they worked, refining protective circles, layering symbols, chanting incantations, and reciting protective words. The fragments reacted almost immediately, subtly shifting in response. Shadows along the walls lengthened unnaturally, twitching at impossible angles, while reflections in the darkened windows warped momentarily before snapping back to normal. It was a constant dance, a battle of perception versus reality, mind against mind. By nightfall, Eli had devised a complex series of layered protections. Multiple concentric circles, each with distinct symbols and chants, designed to anchor the mind more firmly and resist the subtle manipulations of the fragments. Claire and Marcus stood within the innermost circle, hands clasped, chanting alongside him. The protective measures created a small pocket of relative calm, but the fragments had not disappeared, they had simply shifted tactics. Now, rather than attempting direct assault, they began to infiltrate their senses more subtly. The air inside the bookstore grew thick and heavy, carrying faint scents of decay and damp earth that weren't there before. Whispers crept into their minds, barely audible but unmistakable, echoing their thoughts, fears, and memories in distorted tones. Claire felt her own voice answering back to her, but twisted, mocking. Marcus heard his inner doubts spoken aloud, amplified, persistent. Eli noticed the symbols in the chalk glowing faintly, reacting as if alive, pulses of light that mirrored the rhythm of their heartbeats, and the fragment's intent. At first, Claire tried to ignore it. Focused, she repeated to herself over and over. Reality, what she could touch, what she could see clearly, was her anchor. But then, subtly, reality began to waver. The floor beneath her seemed to stretch in one moment, compress in another. The walls of the bookstore appeared to bend, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to unsettle her senses. A shelf of books rippled, the titles shifting to faces she recognized, friends, strangers, forgotten acquaintances, all staring silently with hollow, accusing eyes. Marcus whispered, voice tight, They're testing the boundaries of the circle now. Not breaking it yet, just probing. They want to see how far we can resist. Eli's jaw tightened. We push further. The circle alone is not enough. We must also anchor ourselves mentally. Concentrate on what is tangible, the floor, the walls, each other. Every sensation, every thought, must be recognized as real or manipulated. This is a battle of perception, not just a defensive measure. Hours passed in this tense equilibrium. The fragments probing grew more insistent. Fleeting figures in corners, whispers that mimicked their own voices, reflections that moved independently, stretching and twisting into impossible configurations. Each assault tested their endurance, their focus, their sanity. Claire felt panic rise and fought it down with sheer willpower. Marcus closed his eyes, centering himself, repeating protective words in a rhythm that became almost hypnotic. Eli adjusted the symbols, rechanting lines with precision, ensuring that the structure of the protective measures remained intact despite the fragment's assault. And then, finally, a breakthrough. By layering the circles, refining the incantations, and internalizing the protective words to the point of instinct, the three of them noticed a tangible difference. The fragment's subtle manipulations no longer had the same immediate effect. Shadows moved, but the terror they produced was less intense. Whispers came, but their rhythm could be ignored, recognized as separate from their own thoughts. Reality regained a firmer hold, even as the fragments lingered, waiting for any sign of doubt. Eli exhaled slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. We've strengthened the defenses. The fragments have adapted to our previous methods, but this is progress. They will learn from this, adapt again. But for now we hold. And holding, even for a moment, is victory. Claire leaned against Marcus, shivering but resolute. It's exhausting, she whispered. But if we keep pushing, keep refining, maybe we can stay ahead. Maybe we can survive this. Marcus nodded, eyes scanning the dimly lit bookstore. We have to. No matter what they throw at us next, we push further, adapt faster, and hold the line. Together. Outside, the forest waited silently, patient, dark, and eternal. The lodge's fragments had learned, adapted, and evolved, but so had the survivors. And in the dim glow of lantern light, the three of them, hands clasped, eyes unblinking, minds focused beyond exhaustion, understood one truth. The psychological war was far from over, but with each incremental advance, they reclaimed a sliver of power from the relentless, patient darkness. The night was heavier than usual, as though the forest itself pressed against the bookstore, the rain outside drumming in jagged rhythms that echoed through the minds of Claire, Marcus, and Eli. After days of layered protective measures and constant vigilance, they had grown slightly confident, but the fragments were patient. They had observed, adapted, and were now ready to escalate in a way that was impossible to ignore. The subtle assaults, the fleeting shadows, and whispered doubts, these had been mere probes. Now, the fragments intended to test the limits of the survivors' mental endurance with a full-scale psychological strike. It began with a faint vibration in the air, almost imperceptible at first, but Claire felt it crawling along her skin, threading its way into her nerves. The lanterns flickered violently, casting long, writhing shadows across the floor, walls, and ceiling. These shadows moved independently, coiling and uncoiling like serpents, forming grotesque humanoid shapes whose heads twisted impossibly, faces contorting into expressions of silent rage. Eli immediately began reinforcing the protective circles, tracing new symbols with precise, fast movements, but even he could feel the strain of their mental fortification under this level of pressure. Then came the whispers, sharper, louder, personalized, like someone had infiltrated their minds and was speaking their fears back to them. "You will break, you cannot survive, you belong to us." Each voice was familiar yet distorted. Claire could hear her own mother's voice calling out to her, twisting into a taunt. Marcus heard the voices of old classmates, friends long gone, accusing him of cowardice, mocking every fear he had ever tried to bury. Eli heard the chanting of the lodge fragments themselves, echoing in every corner of his mind, overlapping syllables and symbols until he could barely discern one thought from another. Claire stumbled, gripping Marcus's arm. It's everywhere. Inside me, inside us." Marcus tightened his grip, forcing her to focus on the tangible reality around them. The wooden floor under their feet, the chalked protective lines, the warmth of their hands clasped together. "Hold on," he said, voice firm despite the terror creeping into his own chest. "Focus on what's real. Remember the circle, remember the words, remember reality." The fragment's assault intensified. The protective circle trembled faintly under the mental weight, lines of chalk glowing faintly as if reacting to the fragment's pressure. Shadows on the walls flickered rapidly, forming faces Claire recognized, her own twisted, smiling, and accusing. Marcus's split into multiple distorted versions, each moving independently and glaring at him. Eli's symbols glowed with impossible geometries, pulsating and warping as if alive. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows in chaotic rhythm, a mirror of the chaos inside their minds. Eli's voice was tight but controlled. "They're probing every weakness now. Every hesitation, every doubt is fuel for them. We have to maintain absolute focus. Even a blink, even a thought of giving in will let them breach fully." He reinforced the circle with a final set of symbols, tracing rapid lines of chalk as he intoned protective words in a low, measured rhythm. Claire shut her eyes tightly, reciting her mantra, grounding herself in her breath, in the physical sensations of the floor beneath her, the warmth of Marcus's hand, the faint, steady light of the lanterns. The whispers pressed harder, bending memories and fears into impossible shapes, but she clung to the tangible, refusing to let the fragments claim her perception. Marcus's voice joined hers, steady and rhythmic. "We survive by resisting. Focus on what is real, not what they show. We are together. They cannot break us." For a moment, it felt as if the fragments had won. Shadows and voices consumed the edges of their senses, stretching into the circle itself, whispering impossible things, twisting memories and reality into chaos. Claire felt a cold tendril brush her mind, threatening to drag her into a vision of the lodge pit, its tendrils coiling around her limbs. She screamed silently in her head, resisting, forcing herself back into reality, and the tendril recoiled. Marcus felt his reflection split further, multiplying endlessly until he could barely track which one was real. He pressed his focus onto the circle and onto Claire and Eli, and the reflections faltered. Eli's hands shook as he recited the incantations faster, reinforcing each line of chalk with mental precision. He could feel the fragments testing him directly, probing his thoughts, his intentions, his fears. And yet, even under this immense pressure, he refused to yield. He was the anchor, the stabilizer, and the circle was holding, fragile, strained, but unbroken. Hours passed in this tense, agonizing state. The fragment's attack was relentless, but slowly, through sheer force of will and the protective rituals, the immediate assault began to subside. The shadows receded slightly, the whispering softened, though never entirely disappeared, lingering like a distant, unyielding echo. The circle still held, but every inch of their minds was raw, exhausted, and trembling from the constant pressure. Claire leaned against Marcus, shivering. I thought I would lose myself," she whispered. It's never stopped before. How did we survive this?" Marcus swallowed, voice low but steady. "We held together, focused on what's real, refused to give in. That's the only way to fight them." Eli exhaled, jaw tight, eyes flicking around the room. "They've escalated. They will escalate further." This was only a glimpse of their potential. But we've learned something critical tonight. They may push, they may probe, they may adapt, but if we remain vigilant, they cannot fully claim our minds. That is power. That is resistance. Outside, the forest waited, patient and silent. Rain fell in heavy sheets, masking the rustle of unseen movement among the trees. The lodge fragments had struck in full force, testing the limits of the survivors' endurance, and although they had held, the battle was far from over. Within the bookstore, 3 minds remained tethered to reality, battered but unbroken, aware that the next attack would be even more intense, more personal, and more terrifying. Claire, Marcus, and Eli understood one truth with stark clarity. The fragments would never stop, never relent. But neither would they. And in that fragile, defiant awareness lay their only hope. The night that followed the fragments' full-scale assault was the darkest yet. Even the rain, which had previously been a constant background to their struggle, now fell in sharp, drumming bursts, like the beat of some unseen, malevolent heart. Inside the bookstore, the 3 survivors, Claire, Marcus, and Eli, stood together within the reinforced protective circles, their hands clasped, voices entwined in constant incantation. Their muscles ached, their minds were frayed, and their breaths came in ragged bursts, but they could feel the stakes pressing down with every passing moment. The fragments had grown cleverer, more persistent, and their attacks had escalated beyond mere illusions or whispers. They were now fully aware of the survivors' strategies and seemed to anticipate each response before it could be enacted. Eli, standing at the center, traced the most intricate pattern yet in the chalked floor. A web of interlocking symbols designed to anchor not just the circle but their very perception of reality. "This will push them back," he muttered, voice tight, yet firm with conviction. "But it will demand everything from us. Focus, Claire, Marcus. Absolute focus. Our minds must be steady, our will unbroken. One slip, one thought of doubt, and everything collapses." Claire nodded, her hands clammy, eyes wide but determined. She felt the lodge fragments pressing at the edges of her perception, tugging her toward visions of the pit, of tendrils wrapping around limbs, of shadows consuming the very walls of the bookstore. She forced herself to breathe, to ground herself in the tangible. The cool wood beneath her feet, the chalked lines that glowed faintly under her touch, the steady, reassuring grip of Marcus's hand. "I'm ready," she whispered, though her stomach twisted with fear. Marcus tightened his grip around her hand, scanning the edges of the room as shadows coiled unnaturally, flickering with impossible shapes. "We survive by resisting. Together. Focus on what is real. The circle is our anchor. Everything else, they can try but they cannot claim us." His own voice trembled slightly, but he refused to let the fear break him. And then the fragment struck. Unlike before, this attack was not subtle, it was overwhelming, a full-scale psychological onslaught designed to shatter their perception entirely. Shadows erupted across the walls and ceiling, taking forms that twisted and writhed in impossible geometries. Faces emerged from every reflective surface, some familiar, some impossibly alien, all staring, accusing, mocking. Whispers became voices, voices became screams, and the air itself seemed to warp and pulse in time with the fragment's will. Claire felt a tendril of perception wrap around her mind, pulling her toward a vision of the lodge pit, black and yawning, tendrils reaching for her, for Marcus, for Eli. She gasped and forced herself to recite the protective mantra, louder this time, letting the rhythm anchor her mind. She saw Marcus struggling against his own hallucinations, mirrors splitting his reflection into dozens of distorted versions, each one screaming silently. And Eli's symbols on the floor began to glow violently, reacting to the fragment's pressure, the lines of chalk trembling as though alive. Hours passed in this mental battlefield, time losing all meaning. Every whisper, every flicker of shadow, every subtle shift of perception demanded constant vigilance. The fragments probed for weakness, exploiting fatigue, fear, and doubt. Yet, through sheer willpower and the reinforced protective measures, the survivors held. They learned to distinguish between what was real and what was manipulation, forcing their perception to remain anchored to the physical reality of the circle. Eli's voice rose, steady and commanding, guiding Claire and Marcus through the final stages of the ritual. Focus on the lines, the symbols, the chant. Anchor yourselves. Anchor each other. Together we reclaim this space. Together we deny them. Claire, trembling, traced the outermost symbols of the protective network, her voice joining the rhythm of the incantation, syncing with Marcus and Eli. The shadows writhed, flickered, and screamed silently, but the circle began to push back, solidifying, reinforcing the fragile reality that still clung to their consciousness. The fragments, sensing the resistance, flared one final time, twisting every sensation into terror, but the survivors' unity, focus, and determination were absolute. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the shadows receded. The flickering reflections steadied. The whispers diminished to faint echoes, and the oppressive weight on their minds lifted, though not entirely. They had pushed the fragments back, forced them to retreat into the periphery, but they had not destroyed them. The lodge's influence still lingered, subtle and patient, waiting for another opportunity to infiltrate, to manipulate, to strike. Claire sank to the floor, exhausted but relieved, leaning against Marcus, who collapsed beside her. Eli remained standing for a moment longer, hands trembling as he traced the final protective symbols, ensuring that the circle held. "We did it," Claire whispered. "For now. But they're still out there, aren't they?" Eli nodded slowly. "They are. They never leave entirely. But we've learned how to resist, how to adapt. We survived the worst, and that knowledge is our strength. They may return stronger, cleverer, more patient, but we are ready. We are vigilant. And we are together." The rain continued to fall outside, relentless and heavy, masking the rustling of the forest beyond. The lodge fragments, patient and eternal, had been pushed back but not destroyed. They lingered, coiled in the edges of perception, in the spaces between thought and reality, waiting for the next moment of vulnerability. And inside the dimly lit bookstore, 3 survivors, scarred, exhausted, but resolute, understood a harsh truth. The war against the lodge's darkness was not over. It would never truly be over. But in that fragile, flickering light, within the protective circle they had carved into reality itself, they had claimed victory for tonight. Together they sat in silence, the only sound the rain against the windows and the slow, steady rhythm of their own hearts. They had survived. They had resisted. And for now that was enough.